The glass door of the restaurant flew open with a sharp bang, and every fork in the room stopped moving at once. Lena Hartley did not look up right away. She had learned long ago that the loudest sound in a room was rarely the most dangerous one. She kept pouring water into a glass, her hand perfectly steady, while her ears did the real work. Footsteps. 5 sets. Heavy boots, not shoes. Men who walked like they expected the floor to move out of their way. She set the pitcher down slowly, and finally lifted her eyes. 5 men stood just inside the doorway of Old Hearth Restaurant, the small but well-loved place where Lena had worked for the past year. They wore dark coats despite the warm evening, and their faces carried the kind of calm that only came from men who were used to getting what they wanted. The tallest of them, a broad-shouldered man with a scar cutting through his left eyebrow, scanned the room like he was counting exits. Lena's stomach tightened, but her face stayed smooth, calm, empty of anything that might give her away. At the corner table near the window, a man sat alone, with a plate of untouched food in front of him. He wore a plain gray jacket, nothing fancy, nothing that would make anyone look twice. But Lena had noticed him the moment he walked in an hour earlier. He moved like someone who had trained his whole life to look ordinary. His shoulders were too straight, his eyes moved too carefully, and when their hands had brushed as she set down his glass, she had felt something under his skin that most people did not carry. Power. Quiet, coiled power. He had not told her his name yet. She had not asked. Now, as the 5 men stepped further into the restaurant, the man in the gray jacket set down his fork without a sound. He did not turn around. He did not need to. Lena watched his shoulders shift just slightly, the way a person's body changes right before they decide to fight. The man with the scarred eyebrow spoke first, his voice carrying easily across the quiet restaurant. "Cale, we finally found you without your dog standing guard." A few tables away, an older couple froze mid-bite. A young mother pulled her son closer to her side. Molly, the other waitress on shift that night, stood near the kitchen door, with a tray shaking slightly in her hands. Mrs. Doyle, who owned the restaurant, appeared in the kitchen doorway, her face pale. Lena did not move toward the kitchen. She did not move toward the door either. She stood exactly where she was, near the drink station, watching. The man in the gray jacket, the one they had called Cale, finally turned in his chair. His expression did not show fear. It showed something closer to irritation, the look of a man interrupted during a rare quiet meal. "5 of you," Cale said, his voice low and even. "I should be flattered, or maybe insulted that it took 5. One of the other men, shorter and quicker moving than the rest, let out a short laugh with no warmth in it. "Flattery will not save you tonight." Lena's mind moved fast now, sorting through everything she had learned in the last hour without even trying. This was not a robbery. Robbers did not walk in with 5 men and call a stranger by name. This was something else, something old, something that had been building long before tonight. She thought about slipping toward the back exit like the rest of the staff would expect her to. It would be easy. 3 steps to the kitchen door, out through the alley, gone before anyone noticed. That was what a waitress named Lena Hartley was supposed to do. That was who she had been pretending to be for the last 3 years. But her feet did not move. The man with the scar took another step forward, and this time Lena saw something glint at his side, tucked just inside his coat. Not a phone, not anything a normal customer would carry. Her jaw tightened. "You should not have come here alone," the scarred man said to Cale. "No guards, no allies, just you and your dinner." "I like eating in peace," Cale answered simply. "You would not understand that. You have never sat still long enough to enjoy anything." The comment landed like a slap. Lena watched the shorter man's face twitch with anger, watched how his hand moved just slightly toward his side. She recognized the motion. She had seen it 100 times before, in a life she had tried very hard to leave behind. The 5 men spread out slowly, forming a loose half-circle around Cale's table, cutting off the space between him and the front door. It was a practiced movement, the kind that came from training, not instinct. These were not street thugs. These were soldiers, or something close to it. Cale stood up from his chair without any wasted motion. He was tall, taller than Lena had realized while he sat, and there was a stillness to him now that had not been there a moment ago, like a lake right before a storm arrives. "5 against 1, Cale said. "Tell me, did none of you think that was still not quite enough?" The scarred man smiled, and it was not a kind smile. "We thought about it. Then we remembered you have no guards tonight. No shield. No one to stand between you and us." His eyes flicked briefly around the room, dismissing the frightened customers, the shaking waitress by the kitchen, the pale-faced owner. No one who matters anyway. Lena felt something rise in her chest at those words, something old and sharp that she had spent 3 years trying to bury. No one who matters. She had heard words like that before, in a different place, wearing a different name, standing in a different kind of danger. She thought of Mrs. Doyle's kind face when she had hired Lena without asking too many questions. She thought of Molly, who always saved her the last slice of pie on slow nights. She thought of the old couple by the window who came in every Friday and always left a little extra for her. These people were not soldiers. They were not warriors. They were simply people, trying to have a quiet evening. And now 5 armed men stood in the middle of their small, safe world, ready to turn it into something else. No one who matters. Lena's hands, still resting near the drink station, curled slowly into fists at her sides. The tallest of the 5 men, the one with the scar, reached slowly into his coat. The motion was slow enough to be almost casual, but Lena's eyes caught every detail, the way his fingers wrapped around something hidden inside the fabric, the slight shift of his weight onto his back foot, the readiness in his stance. "You have made powerful enemies, Cale," the man said. "Tonight, we collect what we came for." Cale did not step back. If anything, he seemed to grow taller, steadier, like a mountain deciding it had finally had enough of the wind trying to move it. "You are welcome to try," he said quietly, "but I promise you will not enjoy the attempt." For a moment, the restaurant held its breath, the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the faint crackle of the old radio near the register, still playing gentle music that no longer matched the room, and the frightened shuffle of feet as customers tried to shrink into their chairs, to disappear, to become invisible. Then the shortest of the 5 men lunged. It happened fast, faster than any of the frightened customers could track. He moved toward Cale, with a speed that spoke of years of training, aiming to close the distance before Cale could react. Chairs scraped, someone screamed, a short, cut-off sound quickly swallowed by fear. Molly dropped her tray, and it clattered loudly against the floor. Cale moved to meet him, sidestepping with an economy of motion that showed he had faced worse than this before. But the other 4 men were already closing in from different angles, cutting off any space he might have used to retreat, working together with the practiced coordination of men who had planned this for a long time. Lena's whole body went very still, the way it always did in the space between deciding and acting. 3 years of pretending to be someone quiet, someone harmless, someone who flinched at loud noises and hid in kitchens during trouble. 3 years of swallowing her instincts, of biting her tongue, of choosing to be small, because being small had once felt like the only way to survive. She watched Cale hold off 2 of the men at once, his movements sharp and controlled, clearly the product of real training, real discipline. But 5 against 1 was 5 against 1, no matter how skilled the one might be. She saw the shape of how this would end if nothing changed. She saw it the way she used to see the shape of danger long before it fully arrived, back when seeing that shape had been her entire purpose in life. The scarred man circled around behind Cale, moving toward his blind side, his hand finally pulling free of his coat. Lena's breath left her in one slow exhale. She reached up and untied the apron from around her waist. It was such a small motion, a waitress removing her apron, the kind of thing that happened 100 times a night in restaurants all over the city. But for Lena, it felt like removing a mask she had worn every single day for 3 years, a mask stitched together from quiet mornings and gentle smiles, and the comfortable rhythm of an ordinary life she had built with her own 2 hands, piece by piece, out of nothing. She let the apron fall to the floor. Molly, still frozen near the kitchen door, turned just in time to see it happen. She would tell people later that she had never seen anyone move the way Lena moved in that next moment, that it did not look like walking or running at all, that it looked like something closer to water finding the fastest path downhill. Lena crossed the restaurant floor in the space of 2 heartbeats. The scarred man never saw her coming. One moment his hand was closing around the object hidden in his coat, his focus entirely on the stranger in the gray jacket standing with his back turned. The next moment, a hand caught his wrist with a grip like iron, twisting it away from his body with a controlled, precise motion that spoke of skill far beyond anything a restaurant waitress should ever possess. The man's eyes went wide with shock as he turned to find Lena standing beside him, her expression calm, almost gentle, the same expression she used when refilling water glasses or clearing empty plates. Only her eyes had changed. They had gone sharp and focused in a way that made the hardened soldier's blood run cold. "I would not do that," Lena said quietly, "if I were you." For one long, suspended second, nobody in the restaurant moved at all. The frightened customers. Molly by the kitchen door, Mrs. Doyle, still standing frozen in the doorway. Even Cale, caught mid-motion between two of the other attackers, turned his head, just enough to see the small waitress from table service, holding one of his enemies completely still, with what looked like almost no effort at all. The scarred man tried to pull his arm free. It did not move an inch. "Who?" he said, his voice suddenly unsteady. "Are you?" Lena tilted her head slightly, and for the briefest moment, something that might have been the ghost of a smile touched the corner of her mouth. It was not a cruel expression. It was almost sad, the expression of someone remembering a version of herself she had tried very hard to leave behind. "Tonight," she said, "I am just the waitress who is about to ruin your evening." Behind her, one of the other men shouted a warning, and the fight that had paused for that single frozen second exploded back into motion. But this time, it was different. This time, there were two people standing against five, and one of those two moved like nothing the five attackers had ever trained to face. Cale, still holding his ground against the remaining men, allowed himself one quick glance toward the woman who had, until 60 seconds ago, simply been refilling his water glass with quiet efficiency. Whatever he saw in that glance made his eyes widen, just slightly, with something between disbelief and dawning understanding. Whoever this waitress truly was, she was not what she appeared to be, not even close. And the five men who had walked into Old Hearth Restaurant expecting an easy victory were about to discover, in the most sudden and unforgettable way possible, exactly how wrong they had been. The restaurant, once filled with the soft, comfortable sounds of an ordinary Friday evening, now held its breath around two people who were about to prove that appearances, in this city at least, could be dangerously, wonderfully deceiving. The scarred man tried a different approach, twisting his body to break free of Lena's grip, throwing his weight against her hold with the strength of someone who had spent his entire life training for moments exactly like this one. For most people, it would have worked. Lena was not most people. She shifted her stance a fraction of an inch, redirected his own momentum back against him, and the tall, dangerous man stumbled sideways into an empty table, sending silverware scattering across the wooden floor with a bright, chaotic clatter. He caught himself quickly, spinning back to face her with real anger, now replacing the earlier shock. "You will regret that," he said through clenched teeth. "People keep telling me that," Lena replied evenly. "So far, none of them have been right." Across the room, Cale was holding his own against two attackers, but the strain was starting to show in the tightness of his jaw and the slight hitch in his breathing. He was strong, clearly trained, clearly no stranger to danger. But two skilled opponents working together left little room for mistakes, and Cale had been caught off guard tonight in a way that suggested he rarely allowed himself to be caught off guard at all. One of the men facing him, a broad-shouldered fighter with quick hands, landed a solid strike that forced Cale back a step. The nearby tables scattered as customers pushed themselves further away, some diving beneath their tables entirely, others frozen in place with wide, terrified eyes. Molly, still near the kitchen doorway, finally found her voice. "Someone call for help," she shouted toward Mrs. Doyle, who was already fumbling with the phone behind the front counter, her hands shaking too badly to dial correctly on the first attempt. Lena heard the commotion, but did not allow herself to be distracted. The scarred man came at her again, faster this time, clearly having decided that whatever hesitation he felt earlier was a luxury he could no longer afford. He swung with controlled precision, the kind of strike meant to end a confrontation quickly and decisively. Lena stepped inside the strike rather than away from it, closing the distance instead of retreating, a choice that clearly surprised him. Before he could adjust, she had already redirected his arm and used his own forward motion to send him stumbling past her, off balance and exposed. She did not press the advantage further than she needed to. A quick, controlled motion, and the man found himself unable to keep his footing, landing hard against the base of the drink station with a groan. He did not get back up right away. One down, in a manner of speaking. 4 to go, split between the two of them. Lena turned her attention toward Cale, who was still fighting off the broad-shouldered man and a second attacker, a wiry, quick-moving fighter who kept circling to find an opening. She crossed the floor quickly, positioning herself at Cale's back, closing the gap that the enemy had been trying to exploit. "You did not need to do that," Cale said between breaths, not taking his eyes off the men in front of him. "I know," Lena answered, settling into a ready stance beside him. "I did it anyway." The wiry fighter lunged toward her, testing her reflexes, clearly curious whether her earlier display had been luck or genuine skill. Lena did not give him time to find out slowly. She met his attack directly, her movements precise and economical, wasting no energy on anything unnecessary. Within seconds, the man found himself off balance, his own attack turned against him, sent sprawling across an empty table that collapsed under his weight with a loud crash. The broad-shouldered man facing Cale hesitated for just a moment, clearly recalculating the situation now that 2 of his companions had been so quickly and thoroughly handled by a woman he had assumed was nothing more than restaurant staff. That hesitation cost him. Cale used the opening immediately, his own trained instincts taking over, ending the confrontation with swift efficiency. That left 2 men still standing, both of them backing slightly away now, exchanging uncertain glances. The confidence that had carried them through the front door of Old Hearth Restaurant had drained away entirely, replaced by something far more cautious. "This was not supposed to happen," one of them muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. Lena straightened, brushing a strand of hair away from her face, her breathing barely elevated, despite everything that had just occurred. She looked at the 2 remaining men, with an expression that held no anger, only a kind of tired patience, the look of someone who had hoped for a quiet evening, and had instead found herself doing exactly the kind of work she had spent 3 years trying to leave behind. "You should leave," she said simply. "Well, you still can." The 2 men exchanged another glance, some silent conversation passing between them. For a moment, it seemed as though they might listen, might turn and walk back out the door they had come through with such confidence only minutes before. Instead, one of them reached for something at his belt, his expression hardening with the kind of desperation that made men do foolish, dangerous things. Cale tensed beside her, and Lena felt her own body settle into perfect readiness once more, every instinct she had spent so long suppressing rising to the surface at once, sharp and clear and undeniable. Whatever came next, the quiet, ordinary life she had built for herself in this small city restaurant was already gone. There would be no pretending after tonight, no going back to being simply Lena Hartley, the waitress with the gentle smile and the quick, efficient service. The 5 men lying scattered across the restaurant floor, and the 2 still standing before her now, had made certain of that. She glanced sideways at Cale, this stranger she had served water to less than an hour ago, this man whose true name and true danger she still did not fully understand. "Whoever you really are," she said quietly, "I hope you are worth all of this." Cale's eyes met hers, something unreadable passing behind them. "I am about to ask myself the exact same question about you." Neither of them looked away from the 2 remaining attackers as the tense silence stretched on, the restaurant around them holding its breath once more, waiting to see what would happen next. The man reaching for his belt never finished the motion. A sharp voice cut through the tension from the restaurant entrance. "Drop it, now." Every head turned. A small group of men in dark uniforms had appeared in the doorway, moving with the same disciplined precision the 5 attackers had shown earlier, except these men carried themselves like protectors, not hunters. At their front stood a broad-shouldered man with short-cropped hair and sharp, alert eyes that swept the room in an instant, taking in the overturned tables, the groaning men on the floor, and finally landing on Cale. "Finn," Cale said, something between relief and irritation coloring his voice. "You are late." The man named Finn Cole did not look apologetic in the slightest. "You told us not to follow you tonight. I believe your exact words were, 'Let me have one meal in peace.'" "I stand by that request," Cale said. "You simply chose to ignore it, and I am, for once, grateful that you did." Finn's eyes moved past Cale to Lena, lingering there with open curiosity. The two remaining attackers, seeing the sudden arrival of reinforcements, exchanged one final glance before bolting toward a side door near the kitchen. Finn's men moved to intercept them, but Finn himself raised a hand. "Let them go," he said quietly. "We already know who sent them. Chasing two frightened men through back alleys will not tell us anything we do not already suspect." The restaurant slowly began breathing again. Mrs. Doyle emerged fully from behind the front counter, her phone still clutched in one trembling hand, staring at the wreckage of her once peaceful dining room, with an expression caught somewhere between shock and disbelief. Molly hurried to check on the frightened customers still huddled beneath their tables, her voice soft and reassuring, even though her own hands had not yet stopped shaking. Lena remained still near the center of the room, suddenly aware of every eye that had turned toward her. The adrenaline that had carried her through the last several minutes began to fade, leaving behind a familiar, uncomfortable clarity. She had broken her own rule tonight. The rule that had kept her safe, kept her hidden, kept her alive for 3 quiet years. Finn approached slowly, studying her with the careful attention of a man, cataloging a threat he had not expected to find. "You handled 3 of them yourself," he said. It was not quite a question. "I handled what needed handling," Lena replied, keeping her voice light, though her mind was already racing through exits, through excuses, through every possible way to disappear from this moment, before it demanded more from her than she was ready to give. Cale stepped closer, brushing dust from his sleeve, his gray jacket torn slightly at the shoulder from the earlier struggle. Up close, without the chaos of the fight clouding her focus, Lena noticed things about him she had missed before. The faint, barely visible scar along his jaw, the way his presence seemed to settle the room simply by existing in it, the way certain people carried authority in their very posture without needing to announce it. "You never told me your name," he said. "You never asked," Lena replied. "You were too busy being attacked." A faint, unexpected smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. "Fair enough. I am asking now." She hesitated. 3 years of careful anonymity stood between her and the easy answer he wanted, and giving it to him felt like handing over a key to a door she had worked very hard to keep locked. But something in his eyes, steady and searching, made the lie feel harder to reach for than usual. "Lena," she said finally. "Lena Hartley." "Lena Hartley," Cale repeated, as though testing the shape of the name. "I owe you my life tonight, Lena Hartley. That is not something I say lightly, or often." "You would have managed," Lena said, though she was not entirely certain that was true. "You seemed capable enough before I got involved." "Against 2 of them, perhaps," Cale admitted. "Against all 5, I am less certain how tonight would have ended." His gaze sharpened slightly, curiosity replacing some of the earlier tension. Where did someone who pours water for a living learn to move like that? It was the question she had been dreading since the moment she pulled off her apron, and she still did not have a good answer ready. "Everyone has a past," she said carefully. "Some of us just choose not to talk about it over dinner." Finn, standing nearby, exchanged a glance with 2 of his men, some silent understanding passing between them that Lena did not fully catch. Whatever it meant, it did nothing to ease the tight, watchful feeling settling into her chest. Outside, the sound of sirens grew closer, the local authorities finally responding to Mrs. Doyle's frantic call. Cale's expression shifted immediately, something guarded and practiced sliding into place. "We should not be here when they arrive," he said, more to Finn than to Lena. "Questions I cannot answer tonight will only complicate matters further." Finn nodded, already moving to gather his men, several of whom had begun quietly restraining the 3 attackers still groaning on the restaurant floor, preparing to remove them before the local police arrived and asked questions that would lead nowhere useful. Cale turned back to Lena, and for a moment, something almost hesitant crossed his features, an expression that looked out of place on a man who, only minutes earlier, had faced 5 armed enemies without flinching. Somewhere quieter than a restaurant with a hole where the front window used to be. Lena glanced past him at the shattered glass scattered across the floor near the entrance, evidence of the chaos that had unfolded in what felt like both an instant and an eternity. "I have a job to keep," she said, gesturing vaguely at the wreckage around them. "Assuming Mrs. Doyle still wants me here after tonight." "She will," Mrs. Doyle called out unexpectedly from across the room, her voice still a little unsteady, but carrying real conviction. After what you just did for everyone in this restaurant, you could set the whole building on fire and I would still keep you employed." A ripple of nervous, relieved laughter moved through the handful of customers still gathered near the back of the room, the tension in the air finally beginning to loosen its grip. Cale's eyes stayed on Lena. "Then I will find you here," he said. "Tomorrow, perhaps, when there is less broken glass to step around." Before she could answer, Finn appeared at his side, urgency clear in his posture. "We need to move now, before the local authorities start asking the kind of questions we cannot afford tonight." Cale nodded once, then turned back to Lena one final time. "Thank you," he said, and the simple words carried a weight that suggested he did not offer them often or easily. "Whoever taught you to fight like that, they trained you well." Then he was gone, moving through the shattered doorway with Finn and his men, disappearing into the darkening evening, just as the first flashing lights appeared at the end of the street. Lena stood alone amid the wreckage of the restaurant, her heart still beating faster than she wanted to admit, her mind spinning through everything that had just happened, and everything it might mean for the careful, quiet life she had built. Molly appeared at her side a moment later, staring at her with wide, astonished eyes. "Lena," she said slowly. "What exactly was that?" Lena managed a small, tired smile, though her thoughts were already racing ahead to tomorrow, to the questions she still could not answer, to the man in the gray jacket who had promised to return, and whose real identity, she suspected, was far more dangerous and far more important than she had first imagined. "That," Lena said quietly, bending down to retrieve her fallen apron from the floor, "was a very complicated Friday night." Outside, the flashing lights grew closer, and somewhere across the city, the men who had sent 5 soldiers into a small neighborhood restaurant were already learning that their carefully planned attack had failed in the most unexpected way possible. The 5 rivals who had come for the Alpha King had left with far more questions than answers, and one of those questions, whispered urgently between them as they retreated into the night, centered entirely on the identity of the Waitress, who had fought like no ordinary Omega should have been able to fight at all. Somewhere in the shadows of the city, that question was already beginning to travel, passing from one dangerous ear to another, drawing the kind of attention that Lena Hartley had spent 3 long years trying desperately to avoid. The local police arrived minutes later, filling the small restaurant with radios crackling and notepads flipping open. Lena answered their questions carefully, keeping her account simple and vague. A group of men had come in causing trouble, she said. Things had gotten out of hand. She left out the details that mattered most, the ones about speed and precision and instincts that no ordinary waitress should possess. The officers, distracted by broken glass and overturned tables, did not press her further. Mrs. Doyle backed up every word Lena said without hesitation, her loyalty firm despite the chaos still settling around them. By the time the police finished their report and the last customer had been walked gently out the door, the sky outside had turned fully dark. Molly helped sweep broken glass into a corner, while Mrs. Doyle called a repair service for the shattered front window, her voice steadier now than it had been an hour earlier. "You saved us tonight," Mrs. Doyle said quietly, pausing beside Lena as she wiped down the counter. "I do not know who taught you to fight like that, and I am not going to ask, but I want you to know, I am grateful. More grateful than I know how to say." Lena managed a small nod, unable to find the right words. Gratitude was not something she was used to receiving, not for the parts of herself she had spent years trying to hide. "I just did what anyone would have done," she said softly. "No," Mrs. Doyle replied, shaking her head with quiet certainty. "You did what almost no one could have done. There is a difference." Later that night, after locking up the restaurant and saying goodbye to Molly, Lena walked the familiar 3 blocks to her small apartment above a quiet bakery. The streets were calm now, the earlier chaos feeling almost like a dream compared to the peaceful hum of the city settling into evening. She let herself inside, locked the door behind her out of habit rather than fear, and sat down on the edge of her bed in the dark. Her hands, finally free of the need to appear steady for an audience, trembled slightly as she pressed them against her knees. 3 years. 3 years of quiet mornings and long shifts, and small, simple pleasures, like Molly, saving her the last slice of pie. 3 years of building something that felt, for the first time in her life, close to safe. And tonight, in the space of a few violent minutes, she had risked unraveling every careful thread of that life. She thought of the man in the gray jacket, of the way his eyes had studied her with such open curiosity, such genuine gratitude. Cale. She did not know his full name, did not know exactly what made him important enough for 5 trained men to hunt him down in a quiet neighborhood restaurant. But she knew power when she felt it, and she had felt it radiating from him the moment their hands touched over a water glass. Whoever he truly was, their paths were now tangled together in a way that felt impossible to undo. Lena rose from the bed and crossed to the small window overlooking the street below, watching the quiet city move through its evening routines, utterly unaware of how close disaster had come, to shattering more than just a restaurant window that night. Somewhere out there, 5 men who had failed in their mission were already reporting back to whoever had sent them, and Lena suspected that failure would not go unanswered for long. She thought about the years before Old Hearth Restaurant, before Mrs. Doyle and Molly, and the comfortable rhythm of pouring water and clearing plates. She thought about the training that had shaped her hands to move the way they moved tonight, precise and controlled, and utterly unlike anything a simple waitress should know. She had buried that part of herself so deeply that even she sometimes forgot it was still there, waiting beneath the surface, like a blade kept sharp in a drawer nobody opened anymore. Tonight that blade had come out, and there was no putting it back. A soft knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts. Lena tensed immediately, every instinct sharpening at once, before recognizing the familiar rhythm of the knock. Molly. She opened the door to find her coworker standing in the hallway, still wearing her work uniform, her expression a careful mixture of concern and curiosity. "I know it is late," Molly said, "but I could not stop thinking about what happened. Are you all right?" Lena stepped aside to let her in, grateful, in a strange way, for the ordinary comfort of the gesture. "I am fine," she said. "Tired, but fine." Molly settled onto the small couch near the window, glancing around the modest apartment, as though seeing it for the first time. "You have worked with me for a year," she said slowly. "I thought I knew you." Quiet Lena, who barely talks about her past, who somehow always knows exactly how much sugar every regular customer wants in their coffee. She paused, meeting Lena's eyes directly. "I did not know you could do what you did tonight." "Neither did I," Lena admitted quietly, surprising herself with the honesty of the answer. "Not anymore. I thought that part of me was gone." "Is it going to bring trouble back to us?" Molly asked, her voice gentle, but direct. "The restaurant, all of us." Lena did not have an easy answer for that. She thought of the 2 men who had fled through the side door, of the way Finn and his men had so quickly and quietly cleared away the others, of the practiced efficiency that suggested this was not the first time such an operation had been carried out. She thought of Cale's promise to return. "I do not know," Lena said honestly, "but I will do everything I can to make sure it does not." Molly studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly, accepting the answer, even though it clearly was not the reassurance she had hoped for. "Whatever you are," she said finally, "whoever you used to be before all this, I am glad you are on our side." After Molly left, Lena sat alone in the quiet darkness of her apartment for a long while, listening to the distant sounds of the city settling into night. Tomorrow, Cale had said he would return. Tomorrow, the careful walls she had built around her old life would likely crumble a little further, piece by piece, no matter how tightly she tried to hold them together. For 3 years, she had told herself that hiding was the same as healing, that becoming small and quiet and forgettable was the safest way to survive whatever she had left behind. But tonight had proven, in the space of a few violent minutes, that some parts of a person could never truly be hidden forever, no matter how carefully buried. Somewhere across the city, in rooms far more luxurious and far more dangerous than her small apartment above the bakery, the men who had failed tonight were already answering to someone far more powerful than themselves, someone whose plans for the Alpha King had just suffered an unexpected and deeply unwelcome setback. And that someone, Lena suspected, would not simply let the matter rest. In a tall stone building on the far side of the city, far from the warm lights of Old Hearth Restaurant, a man sat behind a wide wooden desk, listening to the 2 surviving attackers explain, in halting and nervous voices, exactly how their mission had failed. His name was Dorian Vale, and he was not a man accustomed to disappointment. "Say that again," Dorian said quietly, his voice carrying none of the anger one might expect. "That was, in some ways, more frightening than shouting would have been. "You are telling me that 5 trained men were defeated by a waitress?" The taller of the 2 survivors, a wiry man named Grant, shifted uncomfortably where he stood. "She was not an ordinary waitress. She moved like nothing I have ever seen. Faster than Silas. Faster than any of us." Dorian's eyes narrowed slightly. Silas was the scarred man who had led the attack, currently sitting in a holding room several floors below, nursing bruised pride and a sore shoulder after his encounter with the mysterious woman at Old Hearth Restaurant. "Faster than Silas," Dorian repeated slowly. "Silas trained under the Ashcombe Guard for a decade before he came to work for me." "I know," Grant said quietly. "I watched her disarm him in seconds." The room fell silent, except for the soft crackle of the fireplace along the far wall. Dorian rose from his chair and moved to stand before the tall window overlooking the city, his hands clasped behind his back, his mind working quickly through possibilities that troubled him more than he cared to admit. He had spent months planning this attack, gathering information, waiting patiently for the perfect opportunity to catch Cale Ashwood alone and unprotected. The Alpha King's habit of slipping away from his guards for quiet meals had seemed like the ideal weakness to exploit, a small crack in an otherwise carefully guarded life. Dorian had chosen 5 of his most capable men, confident that even without his full council of guards, Cale alone would not be difficult to overcome. He had not accounted for a stranger stepping in to change everything. "Describe her again," Dorian said, turning back to face Grant. "Everything you remember. Do not leave anything out." Grant hesitated, clearly searching for the right words. "She was smaller than any of us. Ordinary looking, at first, the kind of person you would walk past 100 times without noticing. But when she moved," he trailed off, shaking his head slightly. "It did not look like fighting. It looked like something she had done 1,000 times before, like it was simply part of who she was." Dorian's jaw tightened. He had encountered skilled fighters before, had trained many of them himself over the years he had spent building his network of allies and enemies within the shifting, dangerous politics of the kingdom. But something about the description troubled him deeply, stirring old memories he had thought long buried. "Her scent," he said suddenly. "Did either of you notice her scent?" Grant frowned, clearly caught off guard by the question. "I did not think to notice. Everything happened too fast." The other surviving attacker, a quieter man named Nolan, spoke up for the first time. "I noticed," he said slowly. "It was faint, almost hidden, like she had trained herself to suppress it. But underneath, there was something familiar about it. Something I could not quite place." Dorian's expression darkened. Suppressed scent was not a natural trait. It required years of discipline, careful control, the kind of training reserved for very specific purposes, within very specific circles. He knew of only one place where such training had once been common, an order that had scattered and gone quiet years earlier after a series of events that Dorian himself had played no small part in causing. "Leave me," he said quietly. "Both of you. I need to think." Grant and Nolan exchanged uncertain glances before bowing slightly and retreating from the room, closing the heavy wooden door behind them with a soft click. Alone now, Dorian returned to the window, staring out at the distant lights of the city without truly seeing them. His thoughts had drifted backward, years into the past, to a time before he had built his current position of influence, before the careful web of alliances and rivalries that now defined his existence within the kingdom's shifting power structure. He thought of the Alpha King's throne, currently occupied by Cale Ashwood, a position Dorian believed should rightfully belong to someone else, someone with a stronger claim, a more disciplined bloodline, a more legitimate right to rule. Someone like Victor Kane, the ambitious lord who had first approached Dorian with the plan to remove Cale from power, through whatever means proved necessary. Victor was not the only rival gathered against the king. 4 others had joined the effort over the past several months, each bringing their own resources, their own grievances, their own reasons for wanting Cale Ashwood gone from the throne he currently held. Silas had brought skilled fighters and years of military experience. Grant had brought inside knowledge of the Royal Guard's rotation schedules. Nolan had brought careful surveillance and patient planning. And a 5th man, a wealthy merchant named Rowan Ellis, had brought the funding necessary to make it all possible. Together, the 5 of them had believed themselves capable of ending Cale's reign in a single, carefully planned evening. They had not accounted for the waitress. Dorian moved back to his desk and pulled open a locked drawer, retrieving an old, worn folder that he had not opened in years. Inside were documents from a time before his current position, records of an order that had once trained warriors of extraordinary skill, for purposes that remained, even now, only partially understood by outsiders. The order had been disbanded years earlier, following a violent internal conflict, its remaining members scattered across the kingdom, most choosing to disappear entirely, rather than risk drawing attention to skills that had once made them valuable and dangerous in equal measure. He flipped through the old pages slowly, searching for something he half remembered, half hoped he was wrong about. If his suspicion proved correct, the waitress who had so effortlessly defeated 3 trained men at Old Hearth Restaurant was not simply a skilled fighter who happened to be working an ordinary job. She might be something far more significant and far more dangerous to his plans. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Enter," Dorian called, closing the folder before his visitor could see its contents. Victor Kane stepped into the room, his expensive coat still damp from the evening rain outside, his expression sharp with barely contained frustration. "I heard the news," Victor said without preamble. 5 men, and Kale still sits on his throne tonight." "The attack did not go as planned," Dorian said carefully. "That is a generous way to describe complete failure," Victor snapped, crossing the room to stand before Dorian's desk. "We spent months preparing for tonight, months gathering the resources, the men, the perfect opportunity. And it collapsed because of a single waitress?" "Not simply a waitress," Dorian said slowly, choosing his words with care. "Something else, I believe. Something that requires far more caution than we initially accounted for." Victor's eyes narrowed. "Explain." Dorian gestured toward a chair, and Victor lowered himself into it with visible reluctance, clearly unhappy with delays of any kind after tonight's failure. Dorian took his time explaining what Grant and Nolan had described: the suppressed scent, the impossible speed, the training that seemed to run deeper than anything an ordinary person could acquire through simple practice. When he finished, Victor sat in silence for a long moment, processing the information with the same sharp calculation he applied to every decision in his life. "You believe she belongs to the old order," he said finally. It was not quite a question. "I believe it is possible," Dorian admitted. "If true, it changes our entire approach. Members of that order were not simple soldiers. They were trained from childhood, in skills most of our kingdom has forgotten even existed. If Kale has somehow gained the loyalty of one, even by accident, our path forward becomes considerably more complicated." Victor rose from his chair, pacing slowly before the fireplace, his mind clearly working through the implications. "Then we need more information," he said. "Before we act again, we need to know exactly who this woman is, and exactly how deeply she has become entangled with the king." "Agreed," Dorian said. "Reckless action nearly cost us everything tonight. I will not repeat that mistake." Victor stopped pacing, and turned to face him directly. "And if she truly is what you suspect, if she is a member of the old order, sworn to protect whoever she has chosen to serve." Dorian's expression remained carefully neutral, though something calculating moved behind his eyes. "Then we will need a different strategy entirely," he said. "One that does not rely on brute force alone." Outside the tall stone building, the evening rain continued to fall steadily across the city, washing over the quiet streets and the small restaurant where, just hours earlier, an ordinary waitress had revealed herself to be anything but ordinary. Word of the failed attack was already spreading quietly through certain circles of the kingdom, carried by whispered conversations and careful messages passed between allies and informants alike. The 5 rivals who had conspired against Kale Ashwood had suffered their first significant defeat, but Dorian Vale was not a man who abandoned his ambitions easily. If anything, tonight's unexpected setback had only sharpened his resolve, transforming simple political rivalry into something far more personal and far more dangerous. He thought again of the old folder locked away in his desk drawer, of the scattered members of an order that had once been among the most feared and respected fighting forces in the kingdom's history. If the waitress truly belonged to that lineage, she represented far more than a simple obstacle to be removed. She represented a piece on the board that Dorian had not accounted for, and in the careful, calculating game he had spent years building toward his ultimate goal, Unaccounted pieces had a way of becoming either powerful allies or devastating enemies. He intended to discover, as quickly and quietly as possible, which one Lena Hartley would ultimately prove to be. Across the city, in her small apartment above the quiet bakery, Lena had no idea that her name and her secrets had already become the subject of careful, dangerous conversation among some of the most powerful and ambitious men in the kingdom. She had no idea that the quiet life she had built so carefully, over 3 years, now hung in a delicate balance, watched from the shadows by forces she had spent that entire time trying desperately to avoid. Tomorrow, Cale had promised to return to Old Hearth Restaurant, seeking answers about the woman who had saved his life. He had no way of knowing that others, far less friendly, were seeking the very same answers, and that the race to understand Lena Hartley's true identity had already begun in earnest, with far higher stakes than any of them yet fully realized. Several floors below Dorian's office, Silas sat alone in a small, plainly furnished room, his shoulder throbbing beneath a hastily applied bandage. He replayed the fight in his mind again and again, searching for the moment he could have reacted differently, the instant where a better decision might have changed the outcome. He found none. From the moment the waitress had caught his wrist, the fight had belonged entirely to her. He had trained for 10 years under the Ashcombe Guard, had fought in 3 border conflicts, had earned a reputation as one of the most capable fighters in Dorian's growing network of allies. He had never, in all those years, faced anyone who moved with such effortless precision. It unsettled him in a way that his pride refused to fully acknowledge, even alone in the quiet of his own thoughts. A door opened, and Rowan Ellis stepped inside, his fine clothes marking him immediately as someone unaccustomed to the plain surroundings of the holding room. Rowan was the wealthiest of the 5 conspirators, a merchant whose trading network stretched across half the kingdom, and whose grievance against Cale Ashwood stemmed from a series of trade restrictions the young king had imposed shortly after taking the throne. "They tell me you were bested by a serving girl," Rowan said, not bothering to hide the amusement in his voice. Silas's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, refusing to give the merchant the satisfaction of a reaction. "Dorian believes she may belong to the old order," Rowan continued, settling into the room's only chair without invitation. "Personally, I find that difficult to believe. The order scattered years ago. Most of its members are dead, hiding in distant villages, or too old to lift a blade any longer." "You were not there," Silas said quietly. "I was. Whatever she is not ordinary." Rowan studied him for a long moment, his earlier amusement fading into something more thoughtful. "Then we adjust our plans," he said. "Dorian is already working on it. In the meantime, I suggest you rest. We will need you again before this is finished, and I doubt you wish to face her a second time in your current condition." After Rowan left, Silas sat alone once more, staring at the bandage wrapped around his shoulder, his mind circling back again and again to the calm, almost gentle expression on the waitress's face, as she had held his wrist without any visible effort at all. He had faced trained soldiers, hardened mercenaries, even a few minor nobles who fancied themselves warriors. None of them had ever unsettled him the way that single moment had. Whatever the truth turned out to be, Silas found himself hoping, quietly and against his own better judgment, that he would not be the one sent to test it a second time. Meanwhile, in his office above, Dorian remained at his desk long after Victor had departed for the evening, the old folder open once more before him. He traced his finger along a faded page, listing the names of the order's known senior instructors, most crossed out with small, careful notations indicating death or disappearance. Near the bottom of the list, one name remained uncrossed, though a note beside it read simply, "Whereabouts unknown, following the collapse." Dorian stared at that name for a long time, turning old memories over in his mind, memories of a conflict from years earlier that had scattered an entire generation of the kingdom's most skilled warriors into hiding. He had played a role in that collapse, a fact he rarely allowed himself to dwell on, and the thought that one of its trained survivors might now be standing directly between him and his ambitions felt uncomfortably close to a debt finally coming due. He closed the folder and locked it away once more, rising from his desk to stand before the window, watching the rain continue its steady fall over the sleeping city below. Somewhere out there, in a small apartment above a bakery, a woman who called herself Lena Hartley was almost certainly unaware of exactly how much attention her actions tonight had drawn, or how many powerful, dangerous men were now turning their full focus toward uncovering everything she had spent years trying to hide. Dorian allowed himself a small, humorless smile. Whatever came next, one thing had already become clear. The path to removing Cale Ashwood from his throne had grown considerably more complicated and considerably more interesting in the space of a single failed evening. He would need patience now, more than force. He would need information before action. And above all, he would need to discover exactly what kind of woman had chosen, in a single decisive moment, to stand between the Alpha King and 5 men who had believed themselves more than capable of ending his reign. Whatever her reasons, whatever her past, Dorian intended to understand them fully before he made his next move. In his experience, the most dangerous mistakes in any careful plan came not from acting too slowly, but from acting without complete knowledge of every piece already in motion on the board. And for the first time in months of careful planning, Dorian Vale found himself facing a piece he had not accounted for at all. The following afternoon, Old Hearth Restaurant reopened for business, despite the freshly repaired front window still smelling faintly of new glass and paint. Mrs. Doyle had insisted on staying closed only long enough to clean up the worst of the damage, telling anyone who asked that a business that closed its doors after trouble was a business that had already lost. Lena arrived for her shift a little earlier than usual, unable to shake the restless energy that had followed her through a mostly sleepless night. She tied her apron around her waist with steady hands, though her mind kept circling back to the promise Cale had made, before disappearing into the darkness the night before. She did not know if he would actually return, or if the chaos of the attack had simply been one more strange, dangerous encounter, destined to fade into memory. She found out an hour later, when the bell above the door chimed, and Cale Ashwood walked in wearing a plain brown jacket, his expression far more relaxed than it had been during their previous meeting. "You came back," Lena said, setting down the tray she had been carrying. "I said I would," Cale replied, settling into the same corner table he had occupied the night before, though this time he sat facing the door, a small adjustment that told Lena he had learned something from their earlier encounter. "Besides, I believe I still owe you a proper conversation, and an explanation, if you are willing to hear one." Lena glanced around the restaurant, checking that Molly had the other tables covered, before allowing herself to sit briefly across from him. It was against every instinct of careful anonymity she had cultivated over the past 3 years, but curiosity, stubborn and persistent, had won out over caution sometime during her sleepless night. "I am listening," she said. Cale studied her for a long moment before speaking, as though deciding exactly how much truth this conversation could safely hold. "My name is Cale Ashwood," he said finally. "I hold the throne of this kingdom, though I suspect you had already guessed there was more to me than a man enjoying a quiet dinner." Lena kept her expression carefully neutral, though the confirmation settled heavily in her chest. She had suspected something close to this the moment she felt the quiet power radiating from him, but hearing it, confirmed directly, still carried a weight she had not fully prepared for. "The Alpha King," she said slowly. "Eating alone in a neighborhood restaurant, with no guards. A mistake I do not intend to repeat anytime soon," Cale said, a faint, rueful smile touching his mouth. "Though I suspect the mistake worked out better than it had any right to, given who happened to be working here last night." "You still have not asked the question you actually want to ask," Lena observed. Cale's smile faded into something more serious. "Where did you learn to fight the way you fought last night?" Lena had spent the entire sleepless night preparing for this exact question, turning over dozens of possible answers, weighing how much truth she could afford to share against how much danger that truth might invite. In the end, she settled on something close to honesty, though far from the complete picture. "I trained for many years," she said carefully, "under people who believed that certain skills should never be allowed to disappear, no matter how much the world around them changed. I left that life behind 3 years ago. I have not used those skills since, not until last night." "Why did you leave?" Cale asked, his voice gentle rather than demanding. Lena's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the table. "Because the life I was trained for was not a life I wanted to keep living," she said simply. "I wanted something quiet. Something ordinary. This restaurant, this city, the people here who do not know or care what I used to be capable of. That felt like enough." Cale was quiet for a moment, absorbing her words with the same careful attention he seemed to bring to everything. "And now?" he asked. "After last night, do you still believe that quiet life is possible?" It was the question Lena had been avoiding all day, the one that had kept sleep just out of reach through the long hours of the previous night. She looked down at her hands, remembering the ease with which they had moved the night before, the familiar rhythm returning to her body as though it had never truly left at all. "I do not know," she admitted quietly. "I had hoped so, but I suspect last night changed more than I would like to admit." A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the soft murmur of other customers and the gentle clink of dishes from the kitchen. Molly passed by their table twice, casting curious glances in Lena's direction, but wisely choosing not to interrupt. "For what it is worth," Cale said eventually, "I am grateful you were there last night, regardless of what it might mean for the quiet life you built. 5 trained men came to end my reign in a single evening. Without you, I am not certain how that story would have ended." "You seemed fairly capable on your own," Lena said, allowing a small smile to soften her earlier tension. "Against 2, perhaps," Cale admitted, echoing the same words he had spoken the night before. "Against 5, I owe you a debt I am not certain how to properly repay." "You could start by telling me who wants you dead badly enough to send 5 men into a restaurant," Lena said. Cale's expression sobered immediately, the brief lightness of their conversation giving way to something heavier. "That," he said, "is a considerably longer story, one involving certain lords within my kingdom who believe the throne belongs to someone other than me. Men who have spent months, perhaps longer, planning ways to remove me from power, by whatever means prove effective." "And last night was simply the first attempt," Lena said, understanding settling over her with quiet certainty. "I fear so," Cale admitted, "which means, unfortunately, that involving yourself in my troubles last night may not have been the safest decision, however grateful I remain for it." Lena considered his words carefully, weighing the danger against the strange, unfamiliar pull she felt toward this quietly powerful man who had walked into her restaurant seeking nothing more than a peaceful meal. "I made my choice last night," she said finally. "I do not regret it." Cale's eyes met hers, something warm and searching passing between them. "Even knowing it might invite exactly the kind of danger you spent 3 years trying to avoid?" "Even so," Lena said, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she meant it completely. Their conversation continued for another hour, weaving between lighter topics and heavier ones, Cale sharing careful pieces of his life as king, while Lena offered small, guarded glimpses of her own past without revealing too much. She learned that he had taken the throne only 2 years earlier, following his father's unexpected passing, and that the transition of power had left cracks and rivalries that certain ambitious lords had eagerly exploited ever since. He learned that she had grown up far from the city, in a place she described only vaguely as somewhere quiet and remote, and that Old Hearth Restaurant had become the closest thing to home she had found in years of careful, deliberate movement from place to place. Neither of them noticed the man sitting near the restaurant's front window, nursing a slow cup of coffee, while watching their conversation with careful, practiced attention. He had arrived shortly after Cale, taken a seat that offered a clear view of their table, and had made no move to order food beyond the single cup of coffee he had been slowly finishing for the past hour. When Cale finally rose to leave, promising to return again soon, the watching man allowed a few careful minutes to pass before rising himself, dropping a few coins on his table, and slipping quietly out into the afternoon street. He made his way 3 blocks, before ducking into a narrow alley, pulling a small communication device from his coat, and speaking quietly into it. "The king returned to the restaurant," he said. "He spent over an hour with the waitress. Whatever connection formed between them last night, it appears to be growing stronger, not weaker." On the other end of the line, Dorian Vale listened carefully, his expression unreadable in the dim light of his office. "Continue watching," he instructed. "I want to know everything about her routine, her habits, anyone she speaks with regularly. If she truly belongs to the old order, I want to understand exactly what we are dealing with before we act again." "And the king?" the watcher asked. "Watch him as well," Dorian said, "but carefully. No mistakes this time. Whatever advantage the waitress gave him last night, I do not intend to underestimate it a second time." The watcher acknowledged the instruction, and slipped the device back into his coat, disappearing into the flow of the afternoon crowd, one more anonymous face among the many moving through the city's busy streets. Back inside Old Hearth Restaurant, unaware of the careful surveillance that had just concluded outside her workplace, Lena finished her shift with a lighter heart than she had carried in days, the quiet warmth of her conversation with Cale settling comfortably alongside the lingering uncertainty about everything that conversation now meant for her carefully built, quietly fragile life. She had no way of knowing that even as she smiled at the memory of his parting words, promising to see her again soon, dangerous eyes had already begun cataloging every detail of her existence, searching patiently for the truth she had spent 3 years trying so carefully to keep hidden from the world. The calm of that afternoon, however welcome, was destined to be short-lived. That evening, after closing the restaurant and walking home through streets now familiar enough to feel almost comforting, Lena found herself thinking back over the conversation with a kind of careful, guarded happiness she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. There had been something steady about Cale, something that reminded her, in small ways, of the discipline she had once admired in her own teachers, years before she had walked away from that life entirely. She let herself into her apartment and sat by the window, as she often did, watching the quiet street below settle into evening. Her thoughts drifted, unbidden, toward memories she usually kept carefully locked away. She remembered long mornings spent training before sunrise, the discipline required to move silently across uneven ground, the patient repetition that eventually made even the most difficult movements feel like breathing. She remembered the moment she had decided to leave that life behind, a decision made not out of weakness, but out of a desperate desire to choose, for once, an existence that belonged entirely to herself. She had built something good here, something quiet. And now, after a single violent evening, she found herself wondering whether that quiet life had ever truly been as safe as she believed, or whether some part of her had always known it was only borrowed time. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Molly standing in the hallway, 2 paper cups of tea balanced carefully in her hands. "I thought you might want company," Molly said, offering one of the cups as she stepped inside. "After yesterday, and after whatever happened between you and that mysterious man in the gray jacket this afternoon." Lena accepted the tea gratefully, settling onto her small couch, while Molly took the chair across from her. "It was not as mysterious as it might have looked," Lena said, though the small smile tugging at her mouth suggested otherwise. "He looked at you the way people look at something they are trying very hard not to stare at," Molly said, arching an eyebrow. "And you looked back at him the same way. I have worked beside you for a year, Lena. I have never once seen you look at anyone like that." Lena felt warmth rise in her cheeks and busied herself with her tea rather than answering immediately. "He is complicated," she said finally. "More complicated than either of us realized. Complicated enough to bring 5 armed men into our restaurant?" Molly asked, though her tone held more curiosity than accusation. "Complicated enough," Lena confirmed quietly. Molly studied her for a long moment, then set down her tea and reached over to squeeze Lena's hand gently. "Whatever this is," she said, "whatever danger might come with it, I want you to know that Mrs. Doyle and I are not going anywhere. Whatever you decide, whoever you turn out to be, you have a home here. That has not changed, and it is not going to change." The simple kindness of the words settled something unsettled deep in Lena's chest, and for a moment, she allowed herself to feel, fully and completely, how much this small, ordinary life had come to mean to her over the past 3 years. Whatever came next, whatever dangers Cale's world might bring into her own, she found herself determined to protect what she had built here, just as fiercely as she had once protected far more dangerous things, years earlier, in a life she rarely allowed herself to remember. After Molly left for the evening, Lena remained by the window for a long while, watching the city lights flicker against the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, she knew, dangerous men were likely already turning their attention toward understanding exactly who she was and what she meant to the king they wanted removed from power. She thought of Silas, the scarred man whose wrist she had held so easily the night before, and wondered how long it would take his employers to piece together the truth she had spent 3 years trying so carefully to bury. She thought, too, of Cale, of the steady warmth in his voice when he had thanked her, of the genuine curiosity in his eyes, as he had asked about her past, without demanding more than she was willing to give. Whatever role he was destined to play in the chapters of her life still waiting to unfold, she found herself, cautiously, and against her own better judgment, looking forward to finding out. Outside her window, the city continued its quiet evening rhythm, utterly unaware of the careful, dangerous game already unfolding within its streets. A game that would soon draw Lena Hartley far deeper into the world she had once left behind than she could yet imagine. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, and new questions about exactly how much of her old life she would need to reclaim in order to protect the new one she had built so carefully around it. For tonight, though, she allowed herself simply to sit quietly by her window, tea cooling in her hands, and remember what it felt like to hope for something good, even amid the uncertainty gathering steadily on the horizon. 3 days passed quietly, and in that quiet, Lena allowed herself to believe, cautiously, that the danger from that first violent evening had finally begun to fade. Cale visited Old Hearth Restaurant twice more during those 3 days, each visit a little longer than the last, each conversation peeling back another careful layer of the walls both of them had built around themselves. She did not know that those same 3 days had been spent, on the other side of the city, in careful and patient preparation for something far larger than the first failed attack. It happened on a Tuesday evening, during the restaurant's busiest hour. Lena was balancing 3 plates along one arm, weaving between crowded tables with the easy efficiency of someone who had performed the same motions 1,000 times before, when the front door swung open, with a force that sent the bell above it clattering violently against the frame. This time, there were not 5 men. There were 12. Lena's whole body went cold the instant she saw them, recognizing immediately the same disciplined, coordinated movement she had seen 3 nights earlier, except multiplied and refined, clearly the product of careful planning meant to correct every mistake the previous attempt had made. At their front stood a man she recognized instantly, despite never having seen him before in person. Something about his bearing, his calculating eyes, as they swept the room, told her exactly who he must be. Dorian Vale had come himself this time. "Everyone remain calm," Dorian announced, his voice carrying easily across the suddenly silent restaurant, pitched with the kind of authority that expected immediate obedience. "This does not need to become violent, for anyone who simply stays out of the way." Lena set down the plates she had been carrying with careful, deliberate slowness, her mind already racing through the shape of what was about to unfold. 12 men, far more than the last attempt. And this time, they had clearly come prepared for the possibility of facing more than just an unguarded king. Across the room, at his now familiar corner table, Cale rose slowly to his feet, his expression hardening into the same controlled stillness Lena had witnessed during their first encounter. This time, however, she noticed something different in his posture, a readiness that suggested he had spent the past 3 days preparing for exactly this possibility. "Dorian," Cale said evenly, "I confess I expected you to send others again rather than risk yourself." "After last time," Dorian replied, stepping further into the restaurant with unhurried confidence, "I decided this matter required my personal attention, particularly given the unexpected complication you managed to acquire." His eyes shifted deliberately toward Lena, cold and calculating. "Lena Hartley, I have spent 3 days learning everything I could about you. I must say, you are a very difficult woman to find information on. That, in itself, told me almost everything I needed to know." Lena kept her expression carefully neutral, though her pulse had begun to quicken. "I am simply a waitress," she said. "You are simply a very well-trained waitress," Dorian corrected, a thin smile touching his mouth. "One who moves like someone raised within a certain order that most of the kingdom believes disappeared years ago. Tell me, does the name Ashcombe Hall mean anything to you?" Something in Lena's chest tightened sharply at the mention of the name, a name she had not heard spoken aloud in 3 years, a name tied to memories she had worked hard to keep locked away. She said nothing, but the flicker of recognition in her eyes lasted just long enough for Dorian to notice. "There it is," he said quietly, satisfaction coloring his voice. "I wondered if my suspicion was correct. It seems it was." Around the restaurant, customers had begun quietly slipping toward the exits, moving carefully to avoid drawing attention, while Molly and Mrs. Doyle stood frozen near the kitchen doorway, watching the confrontation unfold with visible fear. Finn Cole and 3 royal guards, who had been stationed discreetly outside since Cale's visits had resumed, pushed through the front door moments later, their weapons already drawn, having clearly heard the commotion from the street. 12 against 4, Finn said grimly, taking in the numbers arrayed against them. Better odds than last time, at least. Do not be so certain of your advantage, Dorian said calmly, unbothered by the arrival of reinforcements. I brought enough men this time to ensure that whatever skills your waitress possesses, she will not be enough to change the outcome alone. Cale's eyes met Lena's briefly across the room, an unspoken question passing between them. Lena gave the smallest possible nod, and something in Cale's posture settled, as though her simple confirmation had answered a question he had been carrying since the moment Dorian's men filled the doorway. Then let us find out, Cale said, exactly how wrong you are. The confrontation exploded into motion almost immediately. 12 men surging forward in coordinated waves, designed to overwhelm quickly and decisively. Finn and his 3 guards moved to intercept the largest group, forming a defensive line that pushed back against the initial rush with disciplined precision. Cale met 2 attackers who broke away to target him directly, his movements sharp and controlled, clearly benefiting from days spent preparing for exactly this possibility. Lena moved without hesitation this time, no lingering uncertainty slowing her reaction the way it briefly had 3 nights earlier. She had already made her choice days ago, sitting alone in her apartment turning over the shape of her old life against the new one she had built. Whatever came from tonight, she would not stand aside and watch the people and the world she had grown to love be torn apart in front of her. She intercepted 3 men, attempting to flank Finn's defensive line, her movements economical and precise, each motion calculated to disable rather than destroy, guiding her attackers into positions where their own momentum worked against them. One man crashed into an overturned table, another stumbled into a support beam, and the third found himself pinned against the drink station, in a hold that left him unable to move despite considerable effort to break free. Impressive, Dorian called out from where he remained near the entrance, watching the chaos unfold with careful, analytical eyes rather than joining the fight directly. Ashcombe training truly does live up to its reputation. I had begun to wonder if the stories were exaggerated. Lena did not respond, focusing instead on the 2 additional attackers now converging on her position, clearly having identified her as the most immediate threat among the king's defenders. She met them with the same controlled precision, drawing on muscle memory that felt, despite 3 years of dormancy, as natural and familiar as breathing. Across the room, Cale continued his own fight, his training clearly showing as he held off his attackers with growing confidence, occasionally glancing toward Lena's position to confirm she remained safe amid the chaos. Finn and his guards, though outnumbered, fought with the disciplined coordination of men who had trained together for years, gradually thinning the numbers arrayed against them. Slowly, methodically, the tide of the confrontation began shifting. Where 12 men had entered with confident, coordinated purpose, the restaurant floor now held a growing number of attackers, either unconscious or too injured to continue fighting effectively. Dorian's earlier calm expression had begun to shift into something sharper, more calculating, as he watched his carefully assembled force struggle against defenders he had believed would be easily overwhelmed. Enough, Dorian said finally, his voice cutting sharply across the chaos. The remaining attackers, hearing the command, began pulling back cautiously, regrouping near the entrance where Dorian still stood. The restaurant fell into an uneasy quiet, broken only by heavy breathing and the soft groans of fallen attackers scattered across the wooden floor. Lena stood near the center of the room, breathing steadily despite the exertion, her eyes fixed on Dorian with careful, wary attention. Cale moved to stand beside her, a thin cut along his forearm the only visible sign of the fight he had just endured. Dorian studied the scene before him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You have proven my caution justified," he said finally, addressing Lena directly. "Whatever training you received at Ashcombe Hall, it remains formidable, even after years away from active use." "You should leave," Lena said, echoing the same words she had spoken 3 nights earlier, though this time her voice carried more weight, more certainty. "I intend to," Dorian replied calmly, gesturing for his remaining men to begin retreating toward the door. "Tonight was never meant to end this matter entirely. Consider it instead a valuable education. I now understand exactly what stands between myself and my goals." His eyes lingered on Lena a moment longer, something calculating and patient in his expression. "That understanding will prove far more useful than tonight's failed attempt ever could have." He turned and walked calmly toward the door, his remaining men gathering the injured and retreating alongside him with the same disciplined coordination that had marked their arrival. Within moments, the restaurant stood empty of attackers entirely, leaving behind only overturned furniture, scattered debris, and a room full of shaken but grateful survivors slowly emerging from wherever they had taken shelter during the confrontation. Cale turned to Lena, his expression a complex mixture of relief and concern. "Ashcombe Hall," he said quietly. "I have heard that name before, in old records from my father's time. I did not realize any of its trained warriors still lived, let alone that one had been serving water in my favorite restaurant for the past year." Lena let out a long, unsteady breath, the adrenaline of the fight finally beginning to fade, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion she had not expected. "There is a great deal about my past I have not yet told you," she said quietly. "After tonight, I suspect you deserve to hear all of it." Cale's eyes softened, and he reached out, gently resting a hand against her shoulder, in a gesture that felt far more significant than its simplicity might have suggested. "Whenever you are ready," he said, "I am not going anywhere." Around them, Finn and his guards began the careful work of securing the restaurant and checking on the shaken customers and staff, while Molly and Mrs. Doyle emerged cautiously from behind the kitchen counter, both staring at the wreckage with expressions caught somewhere between shock and weary familiarity, having now witnessed this particular kind of chaos twice within the same week. Outside, the evening sky had darkened fully, city lights beginning to flicker on across the buildings surrounding Old Hearth Restaurant, utterly indifferent to the battle that had just concluded within its walls. Somewhere across the city, Dorian Vale was already turning his attention toward a new strategy, one built now on genuine understanding rather than simple confidence, and Lena Hartley understood, with quiet certainty, that whatever peace she had built over the past 3 years had now been irrevocably changed. The old order she had left behind had found her again, whether she was ready for it or not, and the story of Ashcombe Hall, along with everything it meant about who she truly was, could no longer remain safely buried beneath the quiet, ordinary life she had worked so hard to build. Finn approached a short while later, once the last of the debris had been cleared, and the frightened customers who remained had been gently reassured that the danger, for tonight at least, had passed. He studied Lena with the same careful, assessing look he had given her 3 nights earlier, though this time there was something closer to respect mixed into his expression. 12 men, he said, and you took down 5 of them yourself, working alongside 3 of my own trained guards, without a single wasted movement. He shook his head slightly. I have served the crown for 11 years. I have not seen fighting like that outside of stories my grandfather used to tell about the old warrior orders. The stories were not exaggerated, Lena said quietly. Finn studied her a moment longer, then nodded once, a gesture that seemed to carry real significance. Whatever you decide to do next, he said, know that the King's Guard would be honored to fight beside you again, should it come to that. Lena managed a small, tired smile. Let us hope it does not come to that again anytime soon. I would not count on it, Finn said grimly, glancing toward the door through which Dorian and his remaining men had retreated. A man like Dorian Vale does not simply walk away after a defeat. He regroups. He learns. He returns with something new. The words settled uncomfortably in Lena's chest, echoing thoughts she had already been turning over in her own mind. Dorian had not seemed defeated when he left, not truly. He had seemed thoughtful, calculating, like a man who had just gathered valuable information, rather than suffered a genuine loss. Cale, who had been speaking quietly with Mrs. Doyle about arrangements to help repair the restaurant once again, returned to Lena's side, as Finn moved off to help organize the guards still working to secure the building. Mrs. Doyle insists on staying open again tomorrow, he said, a faint, weary smile touching his mouth. She says closing twice in 1 week would be letting men like Dorian win in a way that has nothing to do with fighting. That sounds like her, Lena said softly, warmth mixing with her exhaustion. Cale's expression grew more serious as he studied her carefully. Ashcombe Hall, he said again, this time more gently, less like a question and more like an invitation. Whatever happened there, whatever you left behind, I would like to understand it, not tonight, if you are not ready, but eventually. Lena looked at him for a long moment, weighing the careful walls she had built around that particular chapter of her past, against the growing certainty that those walls could no longer stand entirely intact. Not after tonight. Not with Dorian now fully aware of exactly what she was and where she had come from. Eventually, she agreed quietly. Perhaps sooner than either of us expected. Molly appeared beside them a moment later, her earlier fear giving way to something more determined, now that the immediate danger had passed. "I am not going to pretend I understand everything happening around here," she said, glancing between Lena and Kale with open curiosity. "But I do know that twice now, this restaurant has still been standing at the end of the night because of you, Lena. Whatever Ashcombe Hall is, whatever you used to be, I am grateful for it." "As am I," Mrs. Doyle added, joining them with a fresh cloth in hand, already beginning the familiar work of cleaning up the wreckage, with the same steady determination she had shown after the first attack. "Though I would not object if the two of you found somewhere quieter to conduct your business going forward. My insurance company is going to have questions." A ripple of tired, relieved laughter moved through the small group, the kind of laughter that came only after real danger had passed, releasing tension that had built too tightly to hold any longer. Even Finn, overhearing the comment as he passed by, allowed himself a brief, genuine smile before returning to his work. Later that night, after the restaurant had finally been secured and the last of the guards had taken up careful positions outside, Kale walked Lena home, through streets now patrolled discreetly by royal guards, stationed at careful intervals along her usual route. Neither of them spoke much during the walk, both lost in their own thoughts about everything the evening had revealed, and everything it still promised to reveal in the days ahead. At her door, Kale paused, studying her with an expression that held equal parts concern and quiet admiration. "Thank you," he said simply, "for choosing, twice now, to stand beside me when you had every reason to walk away instead." "I told you before," Lena said, meeting his eyes steadily despite her exhaustion. "I made my choice already. That has not changed." Kale reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair away from her face, the gesture careful and deliberate, carrying none of the urgency of the battle they had just survived together. "Then I hope you know," he said quietly, "that whatever comes next, you will not be facing it alone." Lena felt something warm and unfamiliar settle in her chest at his words, a feeling she had not allowed herself to fully experience in longer than she cared to admit. "Neither will you," she said softly. After he left, escorted by Finn and the remaining guards back toward wherever his own quarters lay hidden within the city, Lena let herself into her apartment and sat once more by her window, watching the quiet street below settle slowly back into its usual rhythm. The events of the evening replayed in her mind, sharp and vivid, alongside older memories she had kept carefully buried for 3 long years. Ashcombe Hall. Dorian had spoken the name so easily, so confidently, as though he had known exactly what weight it would carry, the moment it reached her ears. She thought of long mornings spent training beneath a demanding but caring mentor, of lessons learned through patience and discipline rather than fear, of a life that had once felt entirely her own, before circumstances beyond her control had forced her to leave it all behind. Tomorrow, she suspected, Kale would ask again, more gently perhaps, but with the same quiet determination she had come to recognize in him. And this time, she found herself thinking, watching the last lights flicker out in the windows across the street, she might finally be ready to answer him honestly. The old order she had left behind had found her again. And for the first time in 3 years, Lena found herself wondering whether running from that truth any longer would serve her half as well as finally, fully, facing it. 2 days later, Kale arrived at Old Hearth Restaurant, just before closing time, waiting patiently at his usual corner table, while Lena finished her final duties for the evening. Molly had already left for the night, and Mrs. Doyle, after exchanging a knowing glance with Lena, retreated to the kitchen with a small, understanding smile, leaving the two of them alone in the quiet, dimly lit restaurant. "You said eventually," Kale reminded her gently, once she had settled into the chair across from him, the last of her closing tasks finally complete. "I am hoping eventually has arrived a little sooner than either of us expected." Lena wrapped her hands around a cup of tea Mrs. Doyle had left for her, feeling the warmth seep into her palms as she gathered her thoughts. She had spent the past 2 days turning the decision over in her mind, weighing the safety of silence against the growing trust she felt toward the man sitting across from her, a trust that had built slowly but steadily since the night 5 strangers had first shattered the careful quiet of her ordinary life. Ashcombe Hall was not simply a school, she began slowly. It was a place that trained people from childhood to serve a very specific purpose. Protectors, guardians, people capable of standing between danger and those who could not defend themselves. Cale listened without interrupting, his full attention focused entirely on her words. I was brought there when I was very young, Lena continued. Younger than most children begin any kind of formal training. The people who ran Ashcombe Hall believed that certain skills needed to be learned early, before fear or hesitation had the chance to take root. They taught us discipline first. Patience, control. The fighting came much later, built on top of everything else. It sounds demanding, Cale said quietly. It was, Lena agreed. But it did not feel cruel, not the way you might expect. The people who trained us cared deeply about what we were becoming. They believed we were meant for something important, something larger than ourselves. She paused, memories rising unbidden, familiar and bittersweet. For a long time, I believed that too. What changed? Cale asked gently. Lena's grip tightened slightly around her cup. This was the part of the story she had never spoken aloud to anyone since leaving that life behind. The part that still, even now, carried a weight she found difficult to fully articulate. There was conflict, she said carefully, within the order itself. Disagreements about how our training should be used, about who we should ultimately serve. It grew serious enough that Ashcombe Hall could no longer hold together. The order scattered. Some of us went into hiding. Others simply disappeared entirely, and I never learned what became of them. And you chose to leave as well, Cale said. I chose to leave, Lena confirmed. I did not want to be part of whatever came next, whatever conflict the disagreements might eventually lead to. I wanted, for the first time in my life, to choose my own path, rather than the one that had been chosen for me since I was a child too young to understand what I was agreeing to. Cale was quiet for a long moment, absorbing everything she had shared. That took a great deal of courage, he said finally. Walking away from the only life you had ever known. It was terrifying, Lena admitted, a small, rueful smile touching her mouth. I did not know how to be anyone other than what Ashcombe Hall had trained me to become. Learning to simply exist, quietly, without purpose or mission, took far longer than I expected. And yet here you are, Cale said softly, still choosing to stand between danger and those who cannot defend themselves. It seems the training may have shaped you more permanently than you realized. Lena considered his words carefully, surprised to find truth in them that she had not fully acknowledged before. Perhaps, she said slowly. Though this time, at least, the choice was entirely my own. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, the quiet restaurant settling around them, the soft hum of the kitchen's refrigerator, the only sound beyond their own breathing. Eventually, Cale reached across the table, gently covering her hand with his own. Thank you, he said, for trusting me with this. I understand what it must have cost you to share it. I trust very few people with this story, Lena admitted, meeting his eyes steadily. I find, somewhat to my own surprise, that I trust you. Something shifted between them in that quiet moment, a deepening of the connection that had been building slowly since the night they first met, transforming gradually from cautious curiosity into something warmer, something neither of them had expected, but neither seemed inclined to resist any longer. Across the city, in his tall stone office, Dorian Vale was engaged in far less peaceful conversation. Victor Kane paced before the fireplace once more, his patience clearly worn thin by the second failed attempt to remove Cale from power. 12 men, Victor said, his voice tight with frustration. 12 trained men. And still the king sits on his throne. I did not expect an easy victory tonight, Dorian said calmly, seated behind his desk with the same careful composure he maintained regardless of circumstance. Tonight was reconnaissance, disguised as an attack. I now understand exactly what we face in the Waitress. That knowledge is worth more than a dozen failed assaults. And what exactly do we face? Victor demanded. A graduate of Ashcombe Hall, Dorian said. Trained from childhood, in skills few in this kingdom still remember exist. She is formidable, without question. But she is also, I believe, still only one person, however skilled. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes sharp with calculation. Which means our approach must change. We cannot simply overwhelm her with numbers a third time. She will only continue to adapt, and Kale's guards grow more prepared with each attempt. Then what do you propose? Victor asked. Dorian's expression grew thoughtful, something patient and calculating settling behind his eyes. We attack what she cannot defend, with strength alone, he said slowly. Ashcombe Hall's warriors were trained to protect others above themselves. That instinct, admirable as it may be, is also a vulnerability, if approached correctly. Victor's eyes narrowed with interest. Explain. The restaurant, Dorian said, the people she works alongside, the owner who employs her, the friend who brings her tea after difficult evenings. She will fight endlessly to protect Kale, certainly, but I suspect she will fight with even greater desperation to protect the ordinary life she has built for herself here. If we can find a way to threaten that life directly, without triggering the kind of confrontation she has already proven capable of winning, we may find a path forward that brute force alone cannot provide. Victor considered this for a long moment, a slow, calculating smile spreading across his face. You intend to isolate her, he said. Separate her from the people and the life she has grown to care about, until she has nothing left to protect but herself. Something along those lines, Dorian agreed. It will require patience and careful planning, qualities our previous attempts have clearly lacked. But I believe it offers a far higher chance of success than simply sending more men into that restaurant to be defeated a third time. Rowan Ellis, who had remained largely silent throughout the conversation, spoke up from his seat near the window. And what of the king himself? Do we abandon the direct approach entirely? Not entirely, Dorian said, but we shift our timeline. Rather than rushing toward another confrontation, we build toward one carefully, weakening his position from multiple directions at once. The Waitress, his standing among the other lords, his resources. When we finally move against him again, I intend for it to be the last time such action proves necessary. The three men continued their careful planning late into the night, weaving together a strategy far more patient and far more dangerous than the direct assaults that had failed twice already. Unlike the previous attempts, this new approach would not announce itself with shattered windows or 12 armed men storming through a restaurant's front door. It would move quietly, carefully, striking at the foundations of the life Lena Hartley had built, rather than confronting her skill directly. Back at Old Hearth Restaurant, unaware of the careful, patient danger now taking shape against her, Lena finished her tea and rose from her chair, the evening's honest conversation with Kale having left her feeling lighter than she had in a very long time. Whatever challenges still lay ahead, she found herself facing them, for the first time in 3 years, not entirely alone. Walk you home? Kale asked, rising alongside her. I would like that, Lena said, and meant it completely. As they stepped out into the quiet evening street together, neither of them could have known that the true danger threatening everything they were building together had not passed at all, but had simply retreated into the shadows to plan a far more patient, far more devastating approach than anything a restaurant full of armed men could ever hope to achieve. The following morning, that patient plan began quietly taking shape. A well-dressed man Mrs. Doyle had never seen before arrived at Old Hearth Restaurant just as she was unlocking the front door, introducing himself politely as a representative from the city licensing office. He carried official-looking papers and spoke with the practiced courtesy of someone accustomed to delivering unwelcome news gently. There have been complaints, he explained, glancing meaningfully at the still visible repairs along the front window frame, evidence of 2 separate incidents within the same week. Concerns about safety, about the kind of trouble this establishment seems to be attracting lately. I am afraid the licensing office will need to schedule a full review. Mrs. Doyle felt her stomach tighten with worry, though she kept her expression carefully composed. This restaurant has served this neighborhood faithfully for over 15 years, she said firmly. Whatever trouble has found us recently was not trouble we invited. I understand, the man said, his tone sympathetic but firm. Nonetheless, the review will proceed. I would encourage you to consider carefully whether certain employees, certain associations, might be contributing to the kind of attention that has drawn these concerns in the first place. He left the papers on the counter and departed without further explanation, leaving Mrs. Doyle staring after him with a growing sense of unease. She did not mention the visit to Lena when her shift began later that morning. not wanting to add another worry to whatever burdens the younger woman was already carrying. But the seed of concern had been planted, quiet and patient, exactly as Dorian had intended. A similar visit found Molly that same afternoon, though hers came in a subtler form. A woman she did not recognize approached her outside the small market where she often bought groceries after her shifts, striking up a friendly conversation that gradually, carefully, turned toward questions about her coworker at Old Hearth Restaurant. How long had Molly known Lena? Did she know much about her past? Had she noticed anything unusual about her, especially in recent weeks? Molly answered the questions politely but vaguely, an old instinct of caution rising unbidden, though she could not have said exactly why the conversation left her feeling unsettled, long after the woman had smiled, thanked her, and walked calmly away down the busy street. That evening, both women found themselves thinking about their strange encounters, neither quite ready to voice their growing unease aloud, both hoping, quietly, that the odd visits meant nothing at all. They did not yet understand that they had become, without any choice of their own, quiet pieces in a much larger and more dangerous game, one being played with patience and precision by a man who had learned, through hard experience, that the people someone loved could often be turned into far more effective weapons than any blade or trained soldier ever could. Dorian Vale, reviewing reports from his careful network of informants late that evening, allowed himself a small, satisfied smile as he read through the day's progress. The seeds had been planted. The careful, patient work of unraveling the quiet life Lena Hartley had built around herself had begun in earnest, far from the reach of blades or trained fighters, in places she would never think to defend with the skills Ashcombe Hall had given her. He closed the reports and turned toward the window, watching the city lights flicker across the darkening skyline. Somewhere out there, Lena Hartley was likely enjoying another quiet evening, unaware that the walls of her carefully built sanctuary had already begun, quietly and invisibly, to crack. It would take time, he knew. Patience remained his greatest advantage in this particular game, far more valuable than the brute force his previous attempts had relied upon. But Dorian Vale had built his entire career on the careful, patient dismantling of obstacles that stood between himself and his ambitions, and he saw no reason why Lena Hartley, however formidable her training, would prove any different in the end. A week passed before the quiet pressure Dorian had set into motion began to show its true shape, and when it finally did, it arrived in a way that made Lena's blood run cold, in a manner neither swords nor armed men had managed to accomplish. She arrived for her evening shift, to find Mrs. Doyle sitting alone at one of the back tables, her face pale, a folded letter clutched tightly in one hand. Molly stood beside her, worry etched clearly across her features. What happened? Lena asked immediately, crossing the room to kneel beside Mrs. Doyle's chair. Mrs. Doyle handed her the letter without a word. Lena unfolded it carefully and read through the formal, carefully worded language, her stomach sinking with each line. The licensing office had completed its review. Old Hearth Restaurant was being cited for numerous safety violations, most of them vague and difficult to dispute, all of them clearly manufactured. The letter concluded with a formal notice of closure, effective within 30 days, unless significant changes were made to address the concerns outlined. 30 days, Mrs. Doyle said quietly, her voice unsteady. 15 years, I have run this restaurant, and they intend to close it in 30 days, over violations that did not exist a month ago. Lena felt something cold and sharp settle into her chest, recognition dawning with terrible clarity. This was not bureaucratic incompetence. This was precisely the kind of patient, calculated cruelty she should have anticipated after Dorian's retreat from the second attack. He had not given up. He had simply changed his weapon. This is my fault, Lena said quietly, guilt and fury tangling together inside her. Do not say that, Mrs. Doyle said firmly, though her hands still trembled slightly around the folded letter. Whatever is happening, whoever is responsible, the fault belongs entirely to them, not to you. Molly reached over and squeezed Lena's shoulder gently. I need to tell you both something, she said carefully. A woman approached me last week, asking questions about you, Lena. I did not think much of it at the time, but now, with this letter arriving so soon after, the pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. Dorian was not simply threatening the restaurant. He was systematically isolating everyone Lena cared about. applying pressure from every direction he could find, exactly as Finn had warned her he might. That evening, after closing the restaurant early and walking Mrs. Doyle safely home, Lena found herself standing outside Cale's temporary quarters within the city, having sent word through Finn that she needed to speak with him urgently. He met her within the hour, his expression immediately serious upon seeing the tightness in her posture. "Dorian is going after everyone I care about," Lena said without preamble, once they were alone in a quiet sitting room. "Not with soldiers this time. With paperwork. With rumors. With careful, patient pressure that I do not know how to fight." Cale listened as she explained everything. The manufactured licensing violations, Molly's strange encounter, the mounting sense that invisible threats were closing in from every direction that her training had never prepared her to counter. When she finished, his expression had hardened into something grim and determined. "This is a different kind of battle," he said slowly. "One I understand considerably better than you do, unfortunately. Political pressure, manufactured accusations, careful isolation. Dorian has played this particular game for years within my own court." "How do we fight it?" Lena asked. "Together," Cale said firmly. "You have spent your life learning to fight with your hands. This kind of battle requires different tools, but it can still be won. I have resources, allies, ways to counter manufactured accusations that Dorian does not expect a simple restaurant to possess." He paused, studying her carefully. "But I suspect there is something else troubling you tonight, something beyond simply the practical threat." Lena was quiet for a long moment, surprised, as she often was now, by how easily he seemed to read what she tried carefully to keep hidden. "Ashcombe Hall taught me to fight," she said finally. "It taught me discipline, patience, control. It did not teach me how to protect the people I love from an enemy who refuses to fight fair. My whole life, danger meant something I could see coming, something I could meet directly. This feels like fighting shadows." "Then let me help you find the shape of those shadows," Cale said gently. "You are not facing this alone, Lena. Not this, and not whatever comes after it." Over the following days, working together with Finn and a small network of allies Cale trusted completely, they began carefully untangling the threads of Dorian's quiet campaign. Cale's own legal advisors reviewed the manufactured licensing violations and found enough inconsistencies to delay the closure indefinitely, buying crucial time while a formal challenge worked its way through the proper channels. Finn's guards discreetly increased their presence around the restaurant and Molly's small apartment, careful enough to remain unobtrusive but present enough to discourage further quiet intimidation. It was during this careful, patient counter-effort that the true test finally arrived, 4 days after Lena had first brought her concerns to Cale. She had stayed late at the restaurant, helping Mrs. Doyle organize documents for the upcoming licensing challenge, when she heard it. A soft, deliberately quiet sound from the alley behind the kitchen, the kind of sound trained ears learned to distinguish from ordinary night noise. She rose immediately, every instinct sharpening at once. "Stay here," she told Mrs. Doyle quietly, moving toward the back door with careful, silent steps. She found 2 men in the alley, dressed in plain, unremarkable clothing, designed to attract no attention, one of them holding a container of something that gave off a faint, unmistakable smell of accelerant. Her stomach turned cold with sudden, sharp understanding. Dorian had grown impatient with paperwork and rumors. He had decided to escalate. "Leave now," Lena said quietly, her voice carrying a warning edge that made both men freeze immediately. "And I will let you walk away from here uninjured." The 2 men exchanged a quick glance, some silent calculation passing between them, before the larger one lunged forward, clearly believing that overwhelming her quickly would end the confrontation before it truly began. He was wrong. Lena moved with the full, unrestrained speed and precision that 3 years of careful restraint had never actually dulled, only kept hidden beneath the surface. She disarmed him within seconds, the accelerant container clattering harmlessly to the ground, his arm pinned at an angle that made further struggle impossible without serious injury to himself. The second man hesitated only a moment before turning to flee, but Lena was faster, closing the distance and ending his escape attempt with the same controlled, decisive precision. Within less than a minute, both men lay subdued in the alley, neither seriously harmed, but both thoroughly unable to continue whatever mission had brought them there. Lena crouched beside the larger man, her expression cold and focused in a way that made him flinch, despite his earlier bravado. "Who sent you?" she asked quietly. He did not answer immediately, and Lena felt the old, familiar patience of her training settle over her, the same patience that had once made her one of Ashcombe Hall's most promising students. She did not need to threaten him further. She simply waited, calm and unmoving, until the silence itself became more uncomfortable than any answer he might have given. "Vale," the man finally admitted, his earlier confidence crumbling entirely. "Dorian Vale sent us. He said the paperwork was not moving quickly enough. He said sometimes a fire speaks more clearly than a letter ever could." Lena's jaw tightened at the casual cruelty behind those words, the willingness to destroy something Mrs. Doyle had built over 15 years, simply to send a message. But beneath the anger, she felt something else settling into place as well, a clarity she had not fully possessed since walking away from Ashcombe Hall 3 years earlier. She had spent 3 years believing that leaving her training behind meant leaving behind the person she had once been trained to become. Tonight, crouched in a dark alley having just prevented 2 men from burning down the only home she had truly known since childhood, she understood, finally and completely, that the two were never truly separate at all. The skills Ashcombe Hall had given her were not the opposite of the quiet life she wanted to protect. They were, perhaps, the very thing that made protecting it possible. She called for Finn, who arrived within minutes with several guards, to take the 2 men into custody, his expression grim as he surveyed the accelerant container and listened to Lena's account of what had nearly occurred. "Dorian has crossed a line tonight that he cannot easily walk back," Finn said quietly, once the 2 attackers had been secured and led away. "Attempted destruction of property, potential harm to innocent civilians. This gives us far more legal standing than manufactured licensing violations ever could." Lena nodded, though her thoughts had already moved past the practical implications, settling instead on something deeper, something that had shifted quietly within her over these past difficult days. She thought of Mrs. Doyle's trembling hands around that formal letter, of Molly's careful worry, of the quiet, ordinary life she had built so painstakingly over 3 years, now revealed as something worth fighting for with every skill she possessed, rather than something she needed to hide those skills in order to protect. When Cale arrived a short while later, alerted by Finn's urgent message, he found her still standing quietly in the alley, staring at the spot where the accelerant container had fallen, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "Are you all right?" he asked gently, crossing the distance between them. "I am," Lena said, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she meant it fully. "I think, for the first time in 3 years, I actually am." Cale studied her carefully, something warm and proud settling into his expression, as he seemed to understand, without needing further explanation, exactly what had shifted within her tonight. "Ashcombe Hall trained you to protect what matters," he said quietly. "Tonight, you proved that lesson still lives within you, exactly where it belongs." "Dorian will not stop after this," Lena said, her voice steady, despite the weight of the warning. "No," Cale agreed, "he will not, but neither will we, and I suspect that is a fact he has not yet fully accounted for." Together, they turned back toward the restaurant, where Mrs. Doyle waited anxiously for news, the quiet alley behind them holding evidence of a threat successfully turned aside, and a promise, unspoken but deeply felt, that whatever patient cruelty Dorian Vale intended to unleash next, would find Lena Hartley ready, fully and completely, to meet it. News of the failed fire spread quickly through Dorian's careful network, and within his tall stone office, the mood had shifted from patient calculation into something far more volatile. Victor Kane paced before the fireplace once more, his frustration now edged with genuine alarm. 2 attempts at force, and now a failed act of destruction traced directly back to us, Victor said sharply. "Finn Cole already has enough evidence to bring formal charges. This entire plan is unraveling." "Nothing is unraveling that cannot be repaired," Dorian said, though even his usual composure showed faint cracks beneath the surface. "We simply need to move faster than the King's legal advisors can respond." Rowan Ellis, seated near the window, folded his hands thoughtfully. "Perhaps it is time to consider whether removing Cale through political means was ever truly achievable," he said carefully. "Perhaps a more direct final effort, executed properly this time, offers our clearest path forward." Dorian considered this for a long moment, old pride warring with practical calculation. 2 failed attacks, a failed act of sabotage. His careful reputation for patient, effective planning had begun to erode with each setback, and men like Victor and Rowan, who had joined this conspiracy expecting swift results, were growing dangerously impatient with delay. One final effort, Dorian agreed finally. Properly planned, properly executed, no half measures this time. 3 days later, that final effort took shape during a public gathering Cale could not avoid attending, a formal ceremony marking the anniversary of his father's founding of a charitable fund for the city's less fortunate districts. Security would be tight, but the event itself, held in a large public hall filled with hundreds of attendees, offered exactly the kind of chaotic environment where a carefully coordinated strike might succeed, where quieter attempts had failed. Lena attended at Cale's side, no longer hiding behind a waitress's apron, but present openly, as someone the court had already begun quietly acknowledging as significant in the king's life, though her official role remained deliberately undefined. Finn's guards filled the hall in careful, watchful positions, and Lena herself remained alert throughout the ceremony, her training keeping her senses sharp, despite the formal, celebratory atmosphere surrounding them. The attack, when it finally came, arrived with brutal efficiency. Smoke devices deployed near the hall's main exits created instant chaos and confusion, while a coordinated group of nearly 20 men, disguised among the formally dressed attendees, moved swiftly toward the raised platform where Cale stood addressing the crowd. "Get him down," Finn shouted, guards immediately moving to form a protective barrier around the king, even as panic spread through the crowded hall. Lena moved instantly, cutting through the chaos with focused precision, meeting the first wave of attackers before they could reach the platform at all. Her training, honed over years and tested repeatedly over these recent difficult weeks, guided her through the confusion, with a clarity that felt, for the first time in a very long while, entirely unhindered by hesitation or doubt. She fought alongside Finn's guards, alongside Cale himself, once he had descended from the platform to join the defense, rather than simply be shielded by it, their combined efforts gradually turning back the coordinated assault, despite its careful planning and significant numbers. Where Dorian's men had expected chaos and confusion to work in their favor, they instead found themselves facing defenders who had spent the past weeks preparing for exactly this kind of coordinated, desperate strike. Near the hall's western exit, Lena caught sight of Dorian himself, watching the unfolding battle from a careful distance, his expression tight with the dawning realization that this final, decisive effort was failing just as thoroughly as the attempts before it. Their eyes met across the chaotic hall, and for a moment, something passed between them, an understanding that this confrontation, however it ended tonight, represented the true turning point in the long, dangerous game they had been playing against each other. "It ends here," Lena said, crossing the distance toward him with steady, purposeful steps, ignoring the chaos continuing to unfold around them as Finn's guards steadily overwhelmed the remaining attackers. Dorian's composure, so carefully maintained throughout their entire conflict, finally cracked visibly. "You do not understand what you are protecting," he said, something almost desperate entering his voice. "Cale's throne was never rightfully his. The bloodline, the legitimacy, all of it, belongs elsewhere. That is not my fight to settle," Lena said calmly, closing the remaining distance between them. "But sending armed men into restaurants and public gatherings, threatening innocent people who have nothing to do with your grievances, that I will not allow to continue." Dorian's hand moved toward a concealed weapon, a final, desperate gesture from a man watching months of careful planning collapse entirely around him. But Lena's training, patient and thorough even now, gave her more than enough time to close the distance and end the confrontation before it could truly begin, disarming him with the same controlled precision she had shown throughout every encounter since that first violent evening at Old Hearth Restaurant. Dorian sank to his knees, defeated fully now, the careful calculation that had defined him throughout their entire conflict, finally giving way to simple, exhausted resignation. Around them, the chaos of the attack was rapidly subsiding, Finn's guards having successfully subdued or captured the remaining attackers, the smoke slowly clearing from the hall's high windows. Cale arrived moments later, his own part in the defense having ended once the immediate threat to the gathered crowd had passed. He looked down at Dorian, kneeling defeated before them, and something complicated moved behind his eyes. Not quite triumph, not quite pity, but something closer to weary relief. "It is over, Dorian," Cale said quietly. "Whatever grievance you believed justified all of this, it ends tonight." Dorian looked up at him, and for the first time since the conflict began, something genuine and unguarded crossed his features. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "or perhaps this was simply the beginning of consequences neither of us fully anticipated." Finn arrived to take Dorian formally into custody, along with several of his surviving co-conspirators, who had been captured during the chaotic confrontation. As the guards led him away, Dorian glanced back once more toward Lena, something almost like respect flickering briefly across his defeated expression. "Ashcombe Hall trained you well," he said quietly. "Better, perhaps, than even they realized." After he had been led away and the hall had begun slowly returning to some semblance of order, Cale turned to Lena, relief and exhaustion mixing openly across his features, now that the immediate danger had finally, truly passed. "It is done," he said softly. "After weeks of danger, after everything Dorian tried to unleash against us, it is finally, truly done." Lena felt the tension that had carried her through the past several weeks finally begin to release, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion, mixed with quiet, hard-won relief. "For tonight at least," she said. "There will be others, I suspect, who share some of Dorian's grievances, even if they lacked his particular methods." "Perhaps," Cale agreed. "But tonight, we have earned the right to simply be grateful that this particular chapter has finally reached its end." Around them, the hall continued its slow return to order, guests emerging cautiously from wherever they had taken shelter during the chaos, guards moving methodically to secure the building and account for every captured attacker. Amid the settling aftermath, Cale reached for Lena's hand, and she let him take it, the simple gesture carrying a weight of shared relief and hard-earned trust that neither of them felt any need to put into words. Whatever challenges still lay ahead, whatever new dangers the kingdom's shifting politics might eventually bring, tonight had proven, decisively and completely, that the bond forged between an Alpha King and the Omega Waitress who had once simply poured his water could withstand far more than either of them had ever expected when their paths first crossed, on an ordinary evening that had turned, so suddenly and so completely, into something extraordinary. In the days following Dorian Vale's capture, the kingdom's court moved through the careful, formal process of accounting for everything the failed conspiracy had touched. Victor Kane and Rowan Ellis, along with several lesser conspirators who had supported the plot from the shadows, were identified and brought before the king's council to answer for their roles in the extended campaign against Cale's throne. The formal proceedings stretched across nearly 2 weeks, filled with testimony, evidence, and the slow, careful work of separating genuine grievance from criminal conspiracy. Lena found herself called before the council as well, though not as someone accused of wrongdoing. Word of her role in defending the king, first at Old Hearth Restaurant and later at the public gathering where Dorian's final effort had finally collapsed, had spread quickly through the court, drawing curiosity and questions that she could no longer avoid answering. She stood before the assembled council on a bright morning, sunlight streaming through the tall windows of the formal chamber, feeling the weight of dozens of curious eyes settling upon her. Cale sat at the head of the gathering, his expression carefully neutral in his official capacity, though the warmth in his eyes when they briefly met hers offered quiet reassurance. Lena Hartley, the council's presiding elder, began, an older woman with sharp, observant eyes who had served the kingdom's judicial matters for over 3 decades. "The council has received extensive testimony regarding your involvement in defending the king against multiple coordinated attacks. We understand you received training at a place called Ashcombe Hall. Can you confirm this?" "I can," Lena said, keeping her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. 3 years of careful anonymity, and now she stood, revealing the truth of her past, before the kingdom's most powerful gathering of officials. "Ashcombe Hall has not operated openly in this kingdom for many years," the elder continued. "Its history remains, for many of us, more legend than confirmed fact. Would you be willing to share what you know of its true purpose and of your own history there?" Lena glanced briefly at Cale, who gave the smallest encouraging nod, before she began speaking, her voice growing steadier with each careful word. She explained the order's true purpose, the training in discipline and protection rather than simple violence, the internal conflict that had eventually scattered its members across the kingdom. She spoke of her own childhood there, the mentors who had shaped her, the difficult decision to leave when the order's internal disagreements had grown too dangerous to remain part of. She did not share every detail, some memories still too carefully guarded even now to offer freely before a room full of strangers, but she shared enough, honest and complete enough, that the assembled council listened with genuine respectful attention, rather than the suspicious curiosity she had half expected. When she finished, the presiding elder studied her for a long moment before speaking again. "The kingdom owes you a considerable debt," she said finally. "Twice you defended the king when armed men sought to end his reign through violence, and once more when a more patient, more insidious threat targeted innocent civilians under your protection. Such service does not go unrecognized, even from someone who came to us wearing the simple apron of a restaurant waitress." A murmur of agreement moved through the assembled council, and Lena felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight and guarded for longer than she cared to admit. For 3 years, she had believed that revealing her past meant losing the quiet, ordinary life she had built. Standing here now, before the kingdom's formal council, she understood that the truth had not destroyed anything she valued. It had simply allowed her to finally, fully, be seen. After the formal proceedings concluded for the day, Cale found her alone in a quiet garden adjoining the council chamber, the afternoon sun casting long, gentle shadows across the carefully tended paths. He approached slowly, giving her space to gather her thoughts after the weight of the morning's testimony. "You did well in there," he said quietly, settling onto a stone bench beside her. It felt strange, Lena admitted, speaking about Ashcombe Hall so openly, after 3 years of carrying that story alone. "How does it feel now?" Cale asked gently. Lena considered the question carefully, watching the sunlight filter through the garden's carefully arranged trees. "Lighter," she said finally, a small, genuine smile touching her mouth. "I did not realize how much energy it took, keeping that part of myself hidden away for so long." Cale reached over, gently taking her hand in his own, the simple gesture carrying the same quiet warmth it always did between them. "I have been thinking about what comes next," he said carefully, "for both of us." "What do you mean?" Lena asked, though something in his tone told her this conversation carried more weight than their usual quiet exchanges. "You defended this kingdom, and defended me personally, at considerable risk to yourself, and to the life you had built," Cale said slowly. "The council has already begun discussing what role you might formally hold within the court, should you wish to accept one. Advisor, protector, whatever title feels right to you." He paused, something more careful and personal entering his voice. "But beyond any formal role, I find myself hoping you might consider staying close to me for reasons that have nothing to do with titles or duties at all." Lena felt her heart quicken at the careful, honest vulnerability in his words, so different from the composed authority he carried in public settings. "Cale," she said softly, "are you asking me something specific, or simply talking around it?" A faint, warm smile touched his mouth, some of his usual composure slipping into something more genuine. "I suppose I am asking whether you might consider building a life here, alongside me, not simply as the woman who once poured my water, or the warrior who twice saved my life, but as someone I have come to care for deeply, in ways I did not entirely expect when I first walked into that restaurant seeking nothing more than a quiet meal." Lena was quiet for a long moment, turning his words over carefully, weighing them against everything she had built, and everything she had lost and rediscovered over these past several extraordinary weeks. 3 years ago, she had walked away from Ashcombe Hall believing that safety meant becoming small, forgettable, entirely separate from the powerful, dangerous world she had been trained within. She understood now, with a clarity that felt both hard-won and deeply comforting, that safety had never truly required disappearing at all. It simply required choosing, carefully and deliberately, who and what deserved her protection, and who deserved her trust in return. "I would like that," she said finally, meeting his eyes steadily. "Building something here, with you. Not because Ashcombe Hall trained me for it, and not because circumstances forced my hand. Because I choose it, freely, for myself." Cale's smile deepened, warmth and relief mixing openly across his features. "Then perhaps," he said softly, "this is not simply the end of a dangerous chapter, but the beginning of something considerably better." That evening, word of the formal council proceedings and their outcome reached Old Hearth Restaurant, carried by Finn, who stopped by to share the news with Mrs. Doyle and Molly directly. Both women listened with growing pride and relief, having worried quietly throughout the weeks of danger and uncertainty about exactly what fate awaited their friend and co-worker. "So she is truly some kind of legendary warrior," Molly said, shaking her head with amazed affection as she processed everything Finn shared. "And here I thought I simply worked alongside someone who was excellent at remembering everyone's coffee order." "She is both, I imagine," Mrs. Doyle said with a fond smile. "The two are not so different as people might assume. Protecting people, whether through careful attention to their coffee preferences or through considerable fighting skill, comes from the same place in the heart." Finn nodded in agreement, a genuine warmth entering his usually composed expression. "The kingdom owes her a debt it cannot easily repay," he said. "I only hope she chooses to remain close enough that we might have the chance to try." Lena arrived at the restaurant shortly after, drawn by old habit, even though her official employment there had grown complicated, amid the whirlwind of recent events. She found Mrs. Doyle and Molly waiting for her with warm smiles and open arms, the formal legend the council had discussed melting away entirely in the face of the simple, genuine affection her friends had carried for her long before they knew anything about Ashcombe Hall. "Whatever grand titles the King's Council wants to give you," Mrs. Doyle said, pulling her into a warm embrace, "you will always have a place here, whenever you want it. Legendary warrior or simple waitress, it makes no difference to us." Lena felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes, overwhelmed by the simple, steady loyalty of the people who had welcomed her so completely into their lives, long before they knew the full truth of who she truly was. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything, for giving me somewhere to belong when I needed it most." The restaurant, quiet now in the gentle evening light, held none of the chaos and danger that had marked so many of its recent nights. Instead, it held something far more valuable: the simple, comfortable warmth of people who had chosen, freely and completely, to stand beside each other through danger and difficulty alike, emerging on the other side, not diminished, but strengthened by everything they had faced together. Cale arrived a short while later, finding Lena surrounded by the warm, familiar comfort of the people who had first welcomed her into this quiet corner of the city 3 years earlier. He watched from the doorway for a moment, something deeply content settling into his expression as he observed the easy, genuine affection between them. Whatever formal role the Kingdom's Council eventually settled upon for Lena Hartley, whatever title they chose to honor her considerable service, Cale understood, watching her laugh softly at something Molly had said, that the truest measure of who she had become was not found in any formal title at all. It was found here, in this small restaurant, surrounded by people who loved her not for the legendary warrior she had once been trained to become, but for the steady, loyal, genuinely kind person she had chosen, deliberately and completely, to remain. Several months passed, and the city settled slowly back into its familiar, comfortable rhythms, the danger and chaos of that extraordinary season, fading gradually into memory, spoken of now, mostly in quiet, amazed conversations, among those who had witnessed it firsthand. Old Hearth Restaurant thrived more than ever, its reputation only strengthened by the stories that had circulated throughout the city about the quiet waitress who had twice defended the Alpha King within its walls. Mrs. Doyle found herself turning away customers some evenings, the small restaurant unable to hold everyone curious to see the place where such extraordinary events had unfolded. Molly had taken on additional responsibilities, training a small team of new waitstaff to help manage the growing crowds, though she always made certain to save the corner table, Cale's favorite, for whenever he and Lena chose to visit together. Lena had accepted a formal role within the King's Court eventually, though not the position of simple advisor or protector the council had first proposed. Instead, working closely with Finn and several other trusted allies, she had begun quietly rebuilding something that had been lost years earlier, when Ashcombe Hall first scattered into hiding. A new generation of protectors, trained not simply in combat, but in the deeper values her own mentors had once instilled in her: discipline, patience, and the genuine desire to serve something larger than oneself. She visited Old Hearth Restaurant often, sometimes still tying on an apron and helping Molly manage a busy evening shift, finding comfort in the simple, familiar rhythms of the work even now that her life held considerably more complexity and purpose than it once had. Mrs. Doyle never objected, understanding, perhaps better than anyone, that some parts of the life Lena had built here would always remain important to her, regardless of whatever grander responsibilities she now carried alongside them. On a warm evening in early autumn, nearly 6 months after the night 5 rivals had first stormed through the restaurant's front door, Cale arrived at Old Hearth just as the dinner crowd was beginning to thin, finding Lena exactly where he had first met her, moving easily between tables with the same quiet efficiency that had first caught his attention on an ordinary Friday evening that had turned into something far more extraordinary than either of them could have imagined. "Busy evening?" he asked, settling into his familiar corner table as she approached. "Always," Lena said, a warm smile touching her mouth as she set down a glass of water in front of him, the same simple gesture that had first connected their two very different worlds, all those months earlier. "Though I suspect you did not come here tonight simply for the water." "You know me too well already," Cale said, his own smile deepening. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small, carefully wrapped object, setting it gently on the table between them. "I have something I would like to give you, not as the king, and not as someone offering gratitude for services rendered to the crown, simply as myself, to you." Lena's eyes widened slightly with curiosity as she carefully unwrapped the small package, revealing a delicate pendant crafted in the shape of an old symbol she recognized immediately, one that had once hung above the entrance to Ashcombe Hall itself, a symbol representing protection freely given rather than duty demanded. "Where did you find this?" she asked softly, turning the pendant carefully in her hands. "I had it made," Cale said quietly. "After hearing everything you shared with the council about Ashcombe Hall's true purpose, I wanted you to have something that honored where you came from, not as a burden you carried, but as a foundation you built the rest of your life upon." He paused, something gentle and hopeful entering his expression. "I wanted you to know that whatever comes next for us, I do not simply value the warrior Ashcombe Hall trained. I value all of it, every part of who you are, the waitress and the protector both." Lena felt her throat tighten with emotion as she studied the careful, thoughtful gift, understanding fully the depth of consideration behind it. "Thank you," she said softly, "for understanding that so completely." Around them, the restaurant continued its familiar evening rhythms, Molly moving between tables with practiced efficiency, Mrs. Doyle calling gentle instructions from the kitchen, the comfortable, ordinary sounds of a neighborhood restaurant going about its business, entirely undisturbed by anything extraordinary at all. It was, Lena reflected, exactly the kind of peaceful evening she had once believed impossible to hold on to once her true identity became known. She had been wrong, she understood now, to believe that safety and truth could never coexist. The past 6 months had proven, decisively and completely, that revealing her true self had not cost her the quiet, ordinary life she treasured. It had simply allowed that life to grow larger, richer, filled with people who loved and respected every part of who she truly was, rather than only the carefully edited version she had once believed necessary to survive. "I have been thinking," Cale said, drawing her attention back to the present moment, "about what comes next for both of us. Not simply tonight, but in the months and years ahead." "And what have you concluded?" Lena asked, settling into the chair across from him despite the busy evening still unfolding around them, trusting Molly to manage without her for a few precious minutes. "That whatever challenges the kingdom still holds," Cale said carefully, "whatever new rivals or difficulties might eventually arise, I find myself considerably more confident facing them, knowing you stand beside me. Not simply as a skilled protector, though that matters a great deal, but as someone whose judgment, whose kindness, whose steady presence makes every difficulty feel considerably more manageable." Lena reached across the table, taking his hand gently in her own, the simple gesture carrying the full weight of everything they had built together since that first violent evening had unexpectedly brought their two very different worlds crashing together. "Then we face whatever comes next together," she said softly. "As we have since the beginning, even if neither of us fully understood that at the time." Outside the restaurant's newly repaired front window, the evening sky settled into gentle twilight, the city continuing its familiar rhythms, entirely unaware of how close disaster had once come to unraveling the quiet, ordinary peace it now enjoyed. Inside, at a small corner table in a modest neighborhood restaurant, An Alpha King and the Omega who had once simply poured his water, sat together, hands joined, facing forward, into whatever future awaited them, with the same quiet, steady courage that had first drawn them together on an ordinary Friday evening that had become, in the end, anything but ordinary at all. The five rivals who had once believed a simple restaurant attack might end a king's reign, had instead, through their own failed ambition, revealed something far more valuable than they could have ever anticipated. They had revealed the hidden strength of a woman who had spent 3 years believing her true self needed to remain buried, and in doing so, they had given both Kale and Lena the chance to discover, together, that the truest kind of strength came not from hiding who you truly were, but from choosing, freely and completely, to let the people who mattered most see you exactly as you are. And in the end, that discovery had proven far more powerful than any blade, any army, or any carefully calculated conspiracy the kingdom's shadows could ever hope to produce.